King of Shadows. Chapter 1. The Funeral. Rain fell in sheets across the cemetery, as if the heavens themselves mourned Nicolò Moretti. Mariella DeLuca stood at the podium, her black veil doing little to hide the perfect composure of her face. Only those who knew her well would recognize the slight tremor in her hands as she gripped the edges of the mahogany stand. Nico was, she began, her voice carrying across the sea of black umbrellas. The Moretti family had turned out in force, along with representatives from every major crime family in the Northeast. A prince had fallen, and protocol demanded their presence. Nico was the light in a world of shadows. From his position in the front row, Dante Moretti, now the sole heir to the Moretti empire, watched her with hooded eyes. At 28, 3 years younger than his brother had been, Dante already carried himself with the cold authority of a man who knew power was now his birthright. Mariella's gaze briefly met his before continuing. Many of you knew him as Vincent Moretti's son, as the heir to the family business. I knew him as the man who could name every constellation in the night sky, who would wake me at 3 a.m. to watch meteor showers, who believed that even in our world there could be beauty. 6 months earlier. You're insane, Mariella laughed, her bare feet dangling off the edge of the yacht as Nico popped the champagne. The Mediterranean sparkled around them, the lights of Positano twinkling in the distance. Completely, Nico agreed, filling her glass. Insane about you. He was beautiful in the moonlight. Olive skin, dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets even from her, the lean, muscled build of a man who worked out not for vanity, but necessity. The Moretti heir couldn't afford weakness. When we get back, he said, his voice dropping to that intimate tone that always made her shiver, I'm going to talk to my father, about changes. Mariella's smile faltered. Nico, we've discussed this. Your father won't. I don't care what he won't do. I'm 30 years old, Mary. I've earned my place, and I want something different for us. He took her hand, his thumb brushing over the diamond engagement ring he'd given her 3 months before. I want us to have children who don't grow up looking over their shoulders. I want legitimate businesses, clean money. Your father will never allow it. Nico's jaw tightened. Then maybe it's time for new leadership. The words hung between them, dangerous and thrilling. Mariella leaned forward and kissed him, tasting champagne and possibility on his lips. Whatever you decide, she whispered against his mouth. I'm with you, always. Present day. Nico had dreams, Mariella continued at the podium, her voice steady despite the memories threatening to drown her. Dreams of transformation, of legacy. He wanted to build something that would last beyond all of us. In the third row, Vincent Moretti, patriarch of the family, sat stone-faced, his massive frame somehow diminished in the months since his eldest son's yacht had exploded in the harbour. The official story was mechanical failure. Everyone knew better. He was taken from us too soon, Mariella said, her eyes now fixed on the gleaming mahogany casket. It was closed, of course. There hadn't been enough of Nico recovered to justify an open viewing. But those who loved him will carry his memory, his vision, forward. As she stepped away from the podium, she caught Dante's slight smirk. He'd been the first to console her after the explosion, his arm around her shoulders feeling like a viper's embrace. The priest finished the service, and one by one the mourners approached to place white roses on the casket. Mariella stood beside it, accepting condolences with the grace expected of the woman who would have been the next Mrs. Moretti. He adored you, Sophia Moretti whispered, Nico's mother's eyes red-rimmed and hollow. You were his future. Thank you, Mrs. Moretti, Mariella replied, squeezing the older woman's hands. What she couldn't say was, and now I have no future at all. When Vincent approached, he didn't speak. He simply placed his massive hand over hers for a moment, his eyes unreadable before moving on. The message was clear. Her connection to the family had died with Nico. Last came Dante, handsome in his tailored black suit, his dark hair slicked back from a face that resembled his brother's just enough to make her heart stutter. "You spoke beautifully," he said, kissing her cheek. His lips lingered a moment too long. Nico would have been proud. "Thank you," she replied, the words ashen in her mouth. "We should talk, Mary," he continued, his voice low. "About your place in the family now. Father respects you, and so do I. There could still be a role for you." She met his gaze, recognizing the calculation there. "Of course, after a suitable period of mourning." He nodded, satisfied, and moved on. Hours later, Mariella stood alone in the penthouse she had shared with Nico. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the Manhattan skyline, the lights blurring through her tears. She'd held them back all day, maintaining the composure expected of her. Now, in private, she finally allowed herself to break. She slid to the floor, her black dress pooling around her, and sobbed, harsh, guttural sounds that tore from her throat. She cried until her voice gave out, until her eyes burned, until her body shook with the force of her grief. When she had no tears left, she rose and walked to the bar, pouring herself 2 fingers of the Macallan 25 that Nico had loved. She carried it to the window and raised it in a silent toast to the city that had been their kingdom. "You promised me," she whispered. "You promised me always." The intercom buzzed, startling her. At this hour, with the doorman knowing she'd just buried her fiancé, it had to be family business. "Yes," she answered, her voice rough from crying. "Package for you, Miss DeLuca. Messenger says it's urgent." She frowned. "Send it up." Minutes later, she opened the door to find a plain manila envelope. No return address, no markings of any kind. She carried it to the dining table and carefully opened it, years of her father's training making her cautious. Inside was a single photograph and a key. The photo showed a marina she didn't recognize, and a boat slip containing a sleek black cigarette boat, the kind Nico had always admired but considered too flashy for family business. She turned the photo over. Written in handwriting she would know anywhere were 3 words: "Trust no one." Mariella's hand flew to her mouth, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew that handwriting, had seen it on love notes, on business documents, on the card that came with her engagement ring. It was Nico's. She sank into a chair, staring at the photo, the key cold in her palm. It wasn't possible. She'd spent the day burying him, had spent a month grieving him, but her father hadn't raised a fool. Antonio DeLuca, before a rival's bullet had found him, had been the most feared enforcer in the Moretti organization. He'd taught his only daughter everything he knew: how to shoot, how to fight, how to survive in a world that would devour the weak. And most importantly, he'd taught her to trust evidence over emotion. Mariella took a deep breath, tucking both items into her purse. She walked to the bedroom and opened the hidden safe behind their wedding portrait, an irony not lost on her. From it, she removed a Glock 19, a passport in a name that wasn't hers, and 50,000 in cash. If Nico was alive, there was only one reason he would have faked his death. He was running from the family. And if that was true, they were both in terrible danger. She changed quickly into jeans and a black sweater, practical clothes for whatever came next. As she zipped up her boots, her phone rang. Dante's name flashed on the screen. Mariella stared at it for 3 rings before answering. "I wanted to check on you," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Today was difficult for everyone, but especially for you." "I'm managing," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline now coursing through her. "Thank you for your concern." "Family takes care of family," Dante said. "And despite what happened to Nico, I still consider you family, Murray." The implication hung in the air between them. Dante had never hidden his attraction to her, even when she was wearing his brother's ring. "That's very kind," she said carefully, "but I need time." "Of course." A pause. "Just remember, the Moretti name still protects you, as long as you remain loyal to the family." The threat beneath the words was clear. "I understand," she said. "Good night, Dante." She ended the call and slipped the phone into her pocket. Whatever game Nico was playing, whatever danger he was in, one thing was now certain. She couldn't trust anyone in the Moretti family, especially not the new heir. Mariella took one last look around the penthouse that had been her home, memorizing it like a crime scene. Then she shouldered her bag, checked her weapon and walked out, locking the door behind her. The hunt for a dead man had begun. Chapter 2. Phantom Sighting. 6 months could change everything and nothing at all. Mariella stared out the window of her suite at the Chicago skyline, the early December snow swirling against the glass. The Langham Hotel offered the kind of luxury and discretion the Moretti family expected for its representatives, even those on collection duty. She checked her reflection in the mirror. Tailored charcoal pantsuit, hair pulled back in a severe bun, minimal makeup highlighting her sharp cheekbones and dark eyes. Gone were the flowing dresses and soft curls Nico had loved. This version of Mariella DeLuca was all business, all edges. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dante. "Updates?" She typed back. "Meeting Callahan at 2. We'll have payment by 5. The response came immediately. "Good. Don't accept excuses." Mariella slipped the phone into her pocket without replying. In the months since Nico's funeral, Dante had pulled her deeper into family operations, positioning her as his right hand. The arrangement served them both. She gained access to Moretti resources and information, while he benefited from her intelligence and the fear her name inspired. The DeLuca reputation hadn't died with her father. If anything, Mariella had enhanced it. She checked her watch. Noon. The meeting with Patrick Callahan, a Chicago developer who'd borrowed heavily from Moretti interests, wasn't for 2 hours. Time enough for lunch and reconnaissance. The restaurant on Michigan Avenue was crowded with holiday shoppers seeking respite from the cold. Mariella secured a table by the window, ordered a salad she had no appetite for, and observed the street. Chicago was outfit territory, but the Morettis had been expanding their legitimate real estate investments here for years. It was a delicate balance, business without encroachment. She was halfway through her meal when she saw him. A man in a charcoal overcoat crossed the street, his collar turned up against the snow. There was nothing remarkable about him. Dark hair, average height, moving with the hurried pace of any businessman on lunch break. Except Mariella knew that walk. The slight favor to the left leg, legacy of a childhood injury. The way his right hand remained in his pocket while the left swung freely. Her fork clattered to the plate. It couldn't be. She'd spent months investigating the marina photo, tracking the cigarette boat to a private dock in Miami, only to discover it had been sold to a shell corporation 6 months before Nico's death. The trail had gone cold, yet here he was, or someone who moved exactly like him, less than 50 yards away. Mariella threw cash on the table and was out the door in seconds, the cold air shocking her lungs as she plunged into the crowd. She caught a glimpse of the charcoal coat turning a corner and quickened her pace, weaving through tourists and shoppers with practiced ease. The man entered a high-end men's clothing store. Mariella paused outside, using the reflection in the window to adjust her scarf, hiding the lower half of her face before entering. The store was busy enough to provide cover, as she pretended to browse ties while keeping him in her peripheral vision. He was at the back, examining suits with a sales associate. From this angle she could only see his profile, but it sent electricity through her veins. The same strong jaw, the same slight hook to the nose from when it had been broken in a fight at 19. Nico, alive. She moved closer, selecting a silk tie from a display, her training keeping her movements casual despite the thunder of her heart. Just as she positioned herself to get a clear view of his face, he turned toward the fitting rooms, following the associate. Mariella abandoned the tie and moved to intercept, but a group of laughing businessmen blocked her path. By the time she maneuvered around them, he had disappeared into the fitting area. She approached the counter. "Excuse me, the gentleman who just went back. Is he a regular customer?" The clerk looked up with a practiced smile. I'm sorry, ma'am, we don't discuss our clients. Mariella leaned in, lowering her voice. Of course. It's just, I think he's an old friend from New York, but I'd hate to embarrass myself if I'm mistaken. The clerk hesitated, then relented slightly. I don't know about New York, but he's been coming in for a few months. Very particular about his tailoring. A few months. Right when she'd hit the dead end in Miami. Thank you, she said, sliding $100 bill across the counter. I think I'll wait and surprise him. She positioned herself near the entrance, ostensibly examining a display of cufflinks while keeping the fitting room exit in view. Minutes stretched into a quarter hour, then half an hour. Finally she approached the fitting rooms, a sense of unease growing. Excuse me, she asked a different associate, did the gentleman in the charcoal coat leave? The young man nodded. About 20 minutes ago, through the back entrance, he got a call and seemed in a hurry. The back entrance. Of course. Mariella exited the store, frustration and confusion warring within her. Had he seen her? Recognized her? Or was this all an elaborate coincidence, her grief-stricken mind seeing Nico in a stranger? No, she knew what she saw. The way he moved was as familiar to her as her own reflection. She checked her watch. The Callahan meeting was in 45 minutes. Professional obligations would have to take precedence over personal ghosts. She flagged a taxi and directed it to the developer's office building, her mind racing. If Nico was alive and in Chicago, there had to be a reason. And if he'd gone to such lengths to disappear, seeing her could spook him into running again. The meeting with Callahan went exactly as expected. The man was sweating before she even sat down, pushing a cashier's check across his desk with trembling hands. It's all there, he said, his voice cracking. Please tell Mr. Moretti I appreciate his patience. Mariella took the check without examining it. Mr. Moretti values your partnership, Patrick. He'd hate to see anything interfere with it. Of course, of course. Callahan loosened his tie. Will you be staying in Chicago long? The question seemed innocent enough, but something in his tone made her pause. As long as business requires, she replied carefully. Why do you ask? No reason. He smiled too quickly. Just thought you might want restaurant recommendations. First time in Chicago, isn't it? It wasn't. She'd been here with Nico twice, though always under the radar, but Callahan shouldn't know that. How thoughtful, she said, rising. I'll be in touch if I need anything. Outside, she immediately called her driver. Take me back to the hotel. No stops. As the car pulled away, she scanned the street, an old habit her father had instilled. Nothing seemed out of place, but the back of her neck prickled with awareness. Something wasn't right. Back at the Langham, she nodded to the concierge and took the elevator to her floor. The corridor was empty, the plush carpet muffling her footsteps as she approached her suite. She paused at the door, listening. Silence. She inserted her keycard and entered cautiously, hand moving to the small of her back where her Glock was holstered. The suite appeared untouched, bed still made, her laptop still closed on the desk, the Do Not Disturb sign still hanging on the doorknob as she'd left it. But the air felt different, disturbed. Mariella moved methodically through the rooms, checking the obvious hiding places first, under the bed, behind the shower curtain, inside the closet. Nothing. Then she noticed it. The suitcase on the luggage rack was zipped exactly as she'd left it, but the lock was positioned differently. Someone had opened it, then carefully closed it again. She checked her hidden compartments. The cash and spare passport were untouched. This wasn't a robbery. It was a search. Moving to her laptop, she opened it and ran a quick diagnostic. No obvious tampering, but that meant nothing these days. She'd have it checked properly when she returned to New York. Mariella sat on the edge of the bed, mind racing. First the Nico look-alike, then Callahan's odd questioning, now this. It couldn't be coincidence. Someone knew she was in Chicago. Someone knew she'd seen something, or someone she shouldn't have. She pulled out her phone to call Dante, then hesitated. If Nico was alive, if he'd faked his death to escape the family, then Dante was the last person she should alert. Instead, she texted her most trusted contact in the Chicago Police Department, a detective her father had kept on payroll for years. Need information on a new player in town. Restaurant consultant named Alexander Reed. It was a shot in the dark, but if the man she'd seen was establishing a new identity, he'd need a cover story. Restaurant consultant would suit Nico's knowledge and connections. While waiting for a response, she methodically swept the room for listening devices, finding nothing. Whoever had searched her belongings was professional, in and out without leaving traces. Her phone buzzed with a reply. Not much. Business registered 8 months ago. Works with high-end restaurants on menu development and staff training. Clean record. Want me to dig deeper? 8 months, right after Nico's death. Yes, she replied. Everything you can find. Address, associates, clients. I'll make it worth your while. She packed quickly, methodically, leaving nothing to chance. She couldn't stay in this hotel now that her room had been compromised. There was a smaller boutique hotel in Lincoln Park where she'd stayed once before, under a different name. It would do for tonight. As she zipped her suitcase, her phone rang. Dante again. Callahan came through, she answered without preamble. Good, Dante replied. But that's not why I'm calling. I need you back in New York, tomorrow. Mariella frowned. I thought you wanted me to meet with the West Side property developers on Thursday. Change of plans. Family meeting. Important. His voice dropped lower. It concerns you directly, Mari. Your future with us. A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the Chicago winter. I'll be on the first flight, she said, mind already calculating. One night. She had one night to confirm whether the man she'd seen was truly Nico before Dante pulled her back to New York. Perfect. She could hear the smile in Dante's voice. I have something special planned, something that will solidify your position in the family. The implication was clear. After months of circling each other, Dante was making his move. I look forward to it, she lied smoothly. After ending the call, Mariella stood at the window, watching snow blanket the city. 6 months of grief, of rebuilding herself into someone harder and colder, someone who could survive in the Moretti world without Nico's protection. And now? Now she didn't know what was real anymore. If Nico was alive, why had he let her believe he was dead? Why had he abandoned her to his brother's ambitions? And most importantly, what would she do when she found him? Because she would find him. That was never in question. The only question was whether she would embrace him or put a bullet in his heart. Chapter 3. The hunt begins. Dawn broke over Chicago, painting the snow-covered city in shades of pink and gold. Mariella hadn't slept. She'd spent the night in her new hotel room, laptop open, piecing together the fragments of a ghost. Alexander Reed. The name itself was bland, forgettable, exactly what someone trying to disappear would choose. Her police contact had come through with an address in Lincoln Park, a high-rise with good security and better views. The business was registered to a P.O. box, with a website showcasing restaurant transformations, but conspicuously lacking any photos of the consultant himself. Clients included 3 of Chicago's most exclusive restaurants, all with connections to legitimate outfit businesses. It was clever. Operating in plain sight within the industry he knew, but just adjacent to the criminal world he'd fled. If it was Nico. She still needed confirmation. Mariella dressed with care. Designer jeans, cashmere sweater, leather boots and jacket. Casual enough not to draw attention, expensive enough to blend in at high-end establishments. She tucked her Glock into a concealed holster at the small of her back, covered by the jacket. Her first stop was a cafe across from Reed's apartment building. She ordered a latte and settled by the window, opening her laptop as if working. The building's entrance was clearly visible. Now it was a waiting game. 3 hours and 2 lattes later, her patience was rewarded. The man in the charcoal coat emerged, now dressed in a navy peacoat and scarf. From this distance, the resemblance to Nico was unmistakable, the same height, build, and distinctive walk. Mariella's hands trembled slightly as she packed her laptop. She left cash on the table and exited the cafe, maintaining a careful distance as she followed him. He walked 2 blocks to a sleek black Audi — Nico had always preferred German engineering — and drove north. She flagged a taxi, instructing the driver to follow the Audi without being obvious. 20 minutes later, they pulled up outside an upscale restaurant in the Gold Coast neighborhood. The sign read Aurelio's. "Wait here," she told the driver, handing him a $100 bill. "I won't be long." Inside, the restaurant was preparing for lunch service. Staff moved efficiently, setting tables and polishing glassware. The man she'd followed stood at the bar with an older gentleman in chef's whites, examining a document between them. Mariella approached the hostess stand. "Excuse me, I'm looking for Alexander Reed. I was told I might find him here." The hostess smiled. "Mr. Reed is with Chef Marco right now. Do you have an appointment?" "No, but it's a personal matter. An old friend from New York." She offered her most disarming smile. "I'd love to surprise him." The hostess hesitated, then nodded toward the bar. "That's him in the blue coat. But please, they're discussing the new menu launch, so—" "I'll be brief," Mariella promised, already moving past her. She approached slowly, heart hammering against her ribs. The man's back was to her, but as she drew closer, she could hear his voice, low, measured, with the faintest trace of a New York accent he'd clearly tried to neutralize. Nico's voice. She stopped a few feet away, suddenly uncertain. What did you say to a dead man? To the love of your life who had abandoned you to grief and danger? Before she could decide, he turned, some sixth sense alerting him to her presence. Their eyes met. Time stopped. Nicolò Moretti, now Alexander Reed, froze, the color draining from his face. He looked both exactly the same and completely different. The same dark eyes, now wide with shock. The same strong features, now framed by shorter hair and the shadow of a beard he'd never worn before. He'd lost weight, the sharp angles of his cheekbones more pronounced. "Mari," he breathed, the name barely audible. The chef looked between them, confusion evident. "Alex? Everything okay?" Nico, Alex, recovered quickly, professional mask sliding back into place. "Fine, Marco. An old acquaintance." He turned to Mariella, his expression now carefully neutral. "Perhaps we could speak privately?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. He led her to a small office at the back of the restaurant, closing the door behind them. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the air between them charged with 6 months of grief, betrayal, and unanswered questions. "You're alive," she finally said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Yes." He remained by the door, as if ready to flee or block her exit. "You let me believe you were dead." The words were flat, emotionless. "You let me mourn you." "I had to." His eyes never left hers, searching for something, understanding perhaps, or forgiveness. It was the only way. "The only way for what, Nico? Or should I call you Alex now?" Bitterness crept into her tone despite her best efforts. "Nico died in that explosion," he said quietly. "He had to. While I stood at his grave, while I delivered his eulogy." Her control slipped, anger flashing. "While your brother circled me like a vulture." He flinched at that. "Dante, has he what? Taken your place? Consolidated power? Decided your grieving fiancé would make a suitable replacement wife?" She stepped closer, fury building. "Yes to all of it." Nico's jaw tightened. "I never wanted that for you. I tried to protect you." "By abandoning me?" She laughed, a harsh sound. "Some protection. I left you the key, the photo. You were supposed to follow—" "I did follow," she snapped. "To a dead end in Miami. You made sure of that." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made her heart ache despite her anger. "I couldn't risk direct contact. Not until I was certain it was safe." "Safe from what? Your family?" "They think you're dead, Nico. Mission accomplished." "Not from my family," he said, his voice dropping. "From yours." Mariella stilled. "What are you talking about?" "Your father's old associates, the ones who survived the purge after his death." Nico moved to the desk, leaning against it. "They've been watching you, Mari, waiting for you to make a move against the Morettis." That's absurd. My father's people are loyal to the family. To the Moretti family? Or to Antonio DeLuca's legacy? He shook his head. Your father had plans. Plans that died with him. Or so everyone thought. Mariella's mind raced. Her father had been the Moretti's most trusted enforcer, but he'd also been ambitious. Before his death, he'd spoken of changes, of a future where the DeLucas weren't just soldiers. What does this have to do with you faking your death? She demanded. Everything. Nico's eyes held hers. Your father's old lieutenant, Salvatore Ricci, he approached me 3 weeks before the explosion. Said he had evidence that my father had ordered your father's hit. The room seemed to tilt. That's not possible. Your father and mine were like brothers. Brothers fight, Mari, especially when one starts building his own power base. Nico's voice was gentle now. Ricci showed me bank records, offshore accounts your father had established. He was preparing to break away, take half the Moretti territory with him. And you believed this? From Ricci? She shook her head in disbelief. I didn't want to, but then Ricci made me an offer. Help him expose my father, take control of the organization, and merge it with your father's old crew, with you and me at the head. Understanding dawned, cold and clear. He was using you to avenge my father. Yes, and when I refused, he threatened to kill you. Nico pushed away from the desk, closing the distance between them. Said if I didn't cooperate, you'd meet the same end as your father. I couldn't risk it, Mari. I couldn't lose you. So you chose to lose me anyway. The words were quiet, laden with pain. I chose to save you the only way I knew how, by disappearing, making them think I was no longer a factor. His hands hovered near her arms, not quite touching. The explosion was supposed to buy me time to dismantle Ricci's operation from the shadows, to make it safe for us. And in 6 months you couldn't find a way to let me know, to spare me the hell of thinking you were gone forever. Her voice cracked despite her resolve. I sent the key. The photo. Regret shadowed his features. When you didn't come, I thought you'd chosen to stay. With the family. With Dante. The accusation stung. I would never. I saw you, Mari. At my father's side during the Colombo meeting. Taking on roles you'd never accepted before. Becoming what I'd always refused to be. I was surviving, she hissed. I was building a position that would give me access, information. I was trying to understand why the man I loved had abandoned me. They stood inches apart now, the air between them electric with anger, hurt, and the undeniable pull that had always existed between them. And now? He asked, his voice low. Now that you've found me, what will you do? Return to New York? To Dante? Before she could answer, her phone buzzed insistently in her pocket. She pulled it out, Dante's name flashing on the screen, the reminder of reality, of obligations and dangers beyond this room. I have to go back, she said, meeting Nico's gaze. Dante's called a family meeting, about me. Understanding darkened his eyes. He's making his move. Yes. And you'll go to him. It wasn't a question. I'll go back, she corrected, to find out what he's planning, to protect myself. She stepped closer, close enough to feel his breath. And to protect you, you idiot. Because if Ricci is still out there, if he discovers you're alive, we're both in danger. Hope flickered across Nico's face. You believe me then? I believe something made you desperate enough to break my heart, she replied. And I need to know what it was. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a burner phone, pressing it into his hand. My number is programmed in. Call me tonight after I land in New York. We need a secure way to communicate. He closed his fingers around the phone, his hand brushing hers. Mari, don't. She stepped back, rebuilding her walls. I haven't forgiven you. I don't know if I can. But I won't let you die for real. Not until I have all the answers. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Still protecting me, after everything. Old habits. She moved toward the door. I have a flight to catch. Be careful with Dante, Nico warned. He's always wanted everything that was mine. Mariella paused, hand on the doorknob. I'm not yours anymore, Nico. Remember that. She left without looking back, the weight of discovery and fresh betrayal heavy on her shoulders. Outside, her taxi waited. "Airport," she instructed, sliding into the back seat. As Chicago receded behind her, Mariella's mind raced with implications and plans. Nico was alive. The foundation of her grief, her rage, her reinvention, all built on a lie he claimed was for her protection. Could she believe him? About Ricci, about her father's death, about his intentions. 6 months ago, she would have trusted Nico with her life without question. Now she wasn't sure she could trust him with her heart. One thing was certain. She needed to return to New York, to face whatever Dante had planned, to maintain her position within the family while she investigated Nico's claims. And if Nico was right about Ricci, about a conspiracy that had claimed her father and nearly claimed them both, then the danger was far from over. The game had changed. She was no longer just a woman mourning her lost love. She was a player in a deadly chess match where every piece was in motion, and no one, not even the dead, was who they appeared to be. As her plane took off, carrying her back to New York and the waiting arms of the Moretti family, Mariella made a silent vow. This time, she would be the one controlling the board. This time, she would be the one to decide who lived and who died, and God help anyone who stood in her way. Chapter 4. Confrontation. The Boston rain fell in icy sheets, drumming against the windows of Mariella's hotel suite at the Four Seasons. She stood at the glass, watching water cascade down the panes, distorting the city lights into smears of colour. The weather matched her mood, turbulent, cold, obscuring clear vision. A week had passed since Dante's proposal, a week of careful navigation through the treacherous waters of Moretti family politics. She'd maintained her role perfectly, appreciative of Dante's attention while gently insisting on time to consider his offer. Chapter 4. Confrontation. Continued. Vincent had watched her with calculating eyes at family dinners, his approval of her business acumen tempered by impatience for her answer. Getting to Boston had required finesse. She'd manufactured a meeting with potential investors in the Moretti's legitimate real estate ventures, providing documentation so thorough that even Dante's suspicious nature was satisfied. Still, she'd noticed the black sedan that had followed her from the airport to the hotel, Dante taking no chances with his prospective bride. Her phone buzzed with a text from the burner, "Room 718, come alone." Mariella checked her appearance in the mirror, black jeans, charcoal sweater, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. No makeup, no jewelry, nothing of the polished Moretti associate remained. This meeting required honesty, and she'd stripped away the armor she typically wore. The Glock, however, remained holstered at her back. Some habits couldn't be broken. She took the stairs rather than the elevator, avoiding the cameras, and approached room 718 from the service corridor. Old habits from her father's training. Never take the obvious path, never be predictable. Her knock was soft but deliberate. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. The door opened immediately, as if he'd been waiting just on the other side. Nico stood before her, dressed similarly in jeans and a dark sweater, his face thinner than she remembered, eyes shadowed with exhaustion or wariness or both. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the reality of his living presence still shocking despite their phone conversations. Then he stepped back, allowing her to enter. The hotel room was standard luxury fare: king bed, sitting area, desk by the window. On the desk lay a laptop and several manila folders. Business, not reunion. That suited her fine. "You weren't followed?" he asked, checking the peephole before securing the door. "Dante had someone on me from the airport, but I lost them before coming up." She remained standing, maintaining distance between them. "Your security precautions?" "Room booked under a third identity, paid cash. I flew private from Chicago to Providence, then drove." He gestured to the sitting area. "We should be secure here." Mariella nodded but didn't sit. "Show me what you have." If her brusqueness wounded him, he didn't show it. He moved to the desk, opening the laptop and one of the folders. "These are the files Ricci showed me initially," he began, spreading photographs and documents across the surface. Bank transfers from a Cayman account controlled by my father to an account linked to the hitman who allegedly killed your father. Mariella approached, examining the documents with a critical eye. The transactions were dated 1 week before her father's murder, substantial sums that could certainly constitute payment for a hit. These could be fabricated, she noted. They could, Nico agreed, which is why I didn't immediately believe Ricci. But then he showed me this. He pulled out a photograph, grainy, clearly taken with a telephoto lens. It showed Vincent Moretti meeting with a man she recognized as Carlos Vega, a Colombian enforcer who had allegedly led the attack that killed her father. This was taken 3 days before your father died, Nico said quietly, at a restaurant in New Jersey owned by a neutral party, no legitimate reason for them to meet. Mariella's throat tightened. Still circumstantial. Yes, but this isn't... He opened another folder, removing a transcript. Phone records between my father and Vega. 17 calls in the 2 weeks leading up to your father's death. She took the transcript, scanning the dates, times, durations. How did Ricci get these? He claims he has someone inside the phone company, but I verified them independently. Nico hesitated. There's more, Mari, about why your father was targeted. He opened a final folder, removing what appeared to be photocopies of handwritten notes. These were your father's, his plans to break away from the Moretti organization, taking his crew and half the territory with him. Mariella recognized the handwriting immediately. Her father's distinctive scrawl, the same hand that had signed her school permission slips and written birthday cards. She took the pages with trembling fingers, reading his detailed strategy for establishing a separate operation, complete with lists of loyal soldiers and potential allies. Where did these come from? She whispered. Ricci claims your father gave them to him for safekeeping, days before he was killed. Nico watched her carefully. He says Antonio suspected Vincent was onto him. The room seemed to tilt slightly as pieces of her past rearranged themselves. Her father's late-night meetings in the months before his death, his cryptic comments about changes coming, the way he'd intensified her training, insisting she learn every aspect of the business. He'd been preparing her to take over. There's one more thing, Nico said gently. The FBI connection. He pulled up files on the laptop, surveillance photos showing her father meeting with a man in a park. This is Special Agent Thomas Reeves. He specialized in organized crime cases until his transfer to Anchorage 3 days after your father's murder. Convenient, Mariella murmured, studying the photos. Very. I tracked him down last month. Nico clicked to another image, a man with greying hair pumping gas at a remote station. He was reluctant to talk, but eventually admitted that Antonio had approached the bureau. Not to inform, he added quickly, seeing her expression harden, but to negotiate. Negotiate what? Immunity. For you. Nico's voice softened. Your father was planning to send you away to college in Europe beyond Vincent's reach. He wanted guarantees that you wouldn't be targeted in any RICO cases against the family. Mariella sank into the chair by the desk, the weight of revelation too heavy to bear standing. He never told me. He was protecting you. Nico knelt beside her chair, not touching her but close enough that she could feel his warmth. Just like I was trying to protect you by disappearing. The comparison hung in the air between them, both justification and accusation. My father died, she said flatly. You chose to leave. Pain flashed across his features. I thought it was the only way to keep you safe from Ricci. He made it clear that if I didn't cooperate with his vendetta against my father, you would be next. So you let me believe you were dead. Let me grieve. The anger she'd suppressed since Chicago flared. Do you have any idea what that did to me, Nico? To wake up every day knowing I'd never see you again, to stand at your grave and say goodbye to everything we'd planned? I sent you the key, he countered, frustration edging his voice. The photo of the boat you were supposed to follow, to a dead end. She stood abruptly, needing distance. I spent weeks tracking that boat to Miami, only to find it had been sold to a shell corporation. There was nothing to lead me to you. Because Ricci's people were watching you. Nico rose as well, his composure cracking. Every move you made after my death was monitored. I couldn't risk direct contact until I was certain you weren't being followed. And in 6 months, you couldn't find a secure way to let me know you were alive? She laughed bitterly. The great Nicolò Moretti, who could arrange anything, couldn't manage a simple message. There was nothing simple about it, he shot back. Ricci has people everywhere. In the Moretti organization, in law enforcement, even in your father's old crew. The moment I surfaced, the moment I contacted you directly, we'd both be targets. So instead you let me become Dante's target. The words were sharp, precise. You left me vulnerable to your brother's ambitions, to your father's manipulations. Nico flinched as if struck. I never thought Dante would— What? Move on your grieving fiancé? Consolidate power in your absence? She shook her head in disbelief. You know your brother better than anyone. You knew exactly what he would do. I thought you would be safer with the family's protection, he admitted, until I could dismantle Ricci's operation and come back for you. Come back for me, she repeated, the words hollow. As if I'm a possession you could leave and retrieve at your convenience. That's not what I meant, isn't it? She moved to the window, needing to look at something other than his face, so familiar and yet changed by months of separation. You made decisions about my life, my safety, without consulting me, just like my father did, just like Vincent and Dante are trying to do now. The rain continued to lash against the glass, the city beyond a blur of lights and shadow. In the reflection she could see Nico standing behind her, uncertainty written in every line of his body. I'm sorry, he said finally, the words inadequate against the weight of her pain. I thought I was protecting you. I was wrong. The simple admission deflated some of her anger. Mariella turned to face him. What does Ricci want? Really? Revenge, Nico replied. Against my father for ordering Antonio's death, against the entire Moretti organization for absorbing your father's crew instead of allowing you to take over. Me? She frowned. I was 22 when my father died, hardly ready to run an operation. But you were Antonio's heir, his only child. Nico moved to the desk, gathering the documents. According to Ricci, your father was grooming you to eventually take his place. When Vincent had him killed and brought you under Moretti protection instead, Ricci saw it as a betrayal of Antonio's legacy. The pieces aligned with painful clarity. Her father's insistence on teaching her every aspect of the business, the way he'd introduced her to his most trusted associates, his emphasis on leadership skills alongside the more practical aspects of survival. And now Dante wants to marry me, she murmured, securing whatever loyalty remains to the DeLuca name. Exactly. Nico's expression darkened. It's strategic, calculated. Like everything the Morettis do. She studied him, this man who had once been the exception to that rule. Including faking your death? He met her gaze unflinchingly. That was desperation, not calculation. I couldn't see another way out. A knock at the door shattered the moment. 3 quick raps, aggressive and demanding. They froze, exchanging alarmed glances. No one should know they were here. Nico moved silently to the peephole, then jerked back, face pale. Dante's men, he mouthed. Mariella's blood ran cold. She moved instantly, helping Nico gather the documents and laptop, shoving them into a backpack as the knocking came again, louder. Miss DeLuca, a voice called. We know you're in there. Mr. Moretti sent us to ensure your safety. The bathroom window, Nico whispered, already moving. It opens to a maintenance platform. We can reach the fire stairs. Mariella nodded, drawing her Glock as she followed him. Years of her father's training kicked in. Assess, adapt, escape. They slipped into the bathroom, Nico working to unlock the window as the knocking at the door became pounding. Miss DeLuca, open the door now! The window slid open, cold rain immediately gusting into the bathroom. Nico went through first, reaching back to help her. As Mariella swung one leg over the sill, they heard the crash of the hotel room door being forced open. Go! she hissed, pushing Nico toward the metal stairs. They descended rapidly, rain soaking them within seconds, the metal treads slippery underfoot. 3 floors down, Nico led her through a service door into a kitchen area, startling workers preparing room service meals. "Health inspection," he barked with authority, flashing what looked like an official ID. "Everyone out now." The kitchen staff scattered, more concerned with potential violations than questioning their credentials. Nico grabbed Mariella's hand, pulling her through the kitchen to a service elevator. "Parking garage," he explained as the doors closed. "I have a car." "How did they find us?" she demanded, checking her weapon. "I don't know." His expression was grim. "Someone must have followed you after all, or tracked your phone." The elevator opened directly into the underground garage. Nico led her to a nondescript grey sedan, unlocking it remotely as they approached. "Get in," he ordered, sliding behind the wheel. Mariella complied, adrenaline sharpening her senses as Nico started the engine and pulled out of the parking space. They were halfway to the exit when 2 black SUVs screeched into the garage, blocking their path. "Damn it," Nico muttered, throwing the car into reverse. He executed a perfect J-turn, tires squealing as they accelerated toward the opposite exit. In the rearview mirror, Mariella could see men emerging from the SUVs, weapons drawn. "They're Dante's enforcers," she confirmed, recognizing 2 of them. "Marco and Vito." "Hold on," Nico warned, swerving around a concrete pillar as the first shots rang out. The back window exploded, glass spraying across the rear seat. Mariella ducked instinctively, then turned to return fire, forcing their pursuers to take cover. Nico drove with the precision she remembered, aggressive but controlled, using the garage's layout to their advantage. He slalomed between parked cars, creating obstacles for the SUVs now in pursuit. They burst out of the garage exit onto a rain-slicked street, tires hydroplaning momentarily before Nico regained control. Traffic was light due to the weather, allowing him to accelerate away from their pursuers. "They'll have the hotel surrounded," he said, checking the mirrors constantly. "And they'll be watching the airports, train stations." "I have a private charter on standby at Hanscom Field," Mariella replied, keeping her weapon ready. "But we need to assume Dante knows about it." Nico nodded, making a sharp turn onto a side street. "I have a safe house in Providence. We can regroup there, figure out our next move." The SUVs appeared in the rearview mirror, gaining ground. Nico swore under his breath, taking another turn, then another, trying to lose them in the maze of Boston streets. "We need to separate," Mariella decided. "They're after me, not you. If we split up—" "Absolutely not," Nico cut her off. "The moment they realize who I am, they'll shoot to kill. Dante would never allow me to return alive." "Then what's your plan?" she demanded. "Because right now, we're just postponing the inevitable." Nico's jaw tightened as he navigated through an amber light, the SUVs momentarily held back by cross-traffic. "There's a parking garage 3 blocks ahead, multi-level, multiple exits. We abandon the car, take the subway to South Station, then a taxi to a secondary location where I have another vehicle." It was a solid plan, exactly what her father would have suggested. Create distance, change transportation methods, leave no trail. "All right," she agreed, checking the clip in her Glock. "But if they catch up to us, I'll hold them off. You get clear with the evidence." Nico shot her a look of disbelief. "I'm not leaving you behind." "This isn't about us," she said firmly. "It's about exposing the truth about my father's murder, about Vincent's betrayal. The evidence is what matters." Before he could argue further, the rear window shattered completely as another shot found its mark. Mariella ducked, then turned to fire back, forcing the lead SUV to swerve. "Almost there," Nico announced, the parking garage now visible ahead. He took the entrance ramp at speed, tires squealing as they ascended to the second level. The garage was nearly empty, their footsteps echoing as they abandoned the car and ran for the stairwell. "Down, not up," Nico directed, taking the stairs 2 at a time. They emerged on the street level just as the SUVs entered the garage above them. Moving quickly but not running attracted attention, they blended into the sparse foot traffic. the rain providing additional cover as pedestrians hurried with heads down, umbrellas obscuring faces. The subway entrance appeared ahead, a welcome sanctuary from both pursuers and weather. They descended into the station, Nico purchasing tickets from a machine while Mariella kept watch, her hand never far from her concealed weapon. The platform was nearly deserted, a handful of commuters waiting for the late train. Mariella positioned herself with her back to a column, scanning constantly for threats. Nico stood beside her, tension radiating from his body. "If they check the security cameras," she began. "They will," he acknowledged. "But it buys us time. Distance." The train arrived with a rush of displaced air, doors sliding open to reveal an equally empty car. They boarded quickly, taking seats that allowed them to monitor both ends of the car. As the train pulled away from the station, Mariella finally allowed herself to breathe. They had escaped, for now, but the reality of their situation settled over her like a shroud. Dante knew. Somehow he had discovered her meeting with Nico, which meant her position within the Moretti organization was compromised. She couldn't go back to New York, couldn't maintain the careful facade she'd constructed over the past 6 months. Everything had changed in an instant. Chapter 5. Reluctant Alliance. Frank's basement wasn't meant for comfort. Concrete floors, exposed pipes, a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. It was a place designed for utility, not hospitality. Yet for Mariella and Nico, it represented something precious, temporary safety. 2 days, Frank had told them gruffly. "That's all I can give you. After that, you're on your own." Mariella sat on the edge of a worn cot, watching as Nico inventoried the supplies Frank had provided. Weapons, ammunition, burner phones, cash, and new identification documents. His movements were methodical, precise. The same careful attention to detail she remembered from their life before. "Your friend seems well equipped for emergencies," she observed, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since leaving Boston 3 hours earlier. Nico glanced up briefly. "Frank was my mother's driver before she married my father. He's helped me disappear before." "When you died," she clarified. "Yes." He continued his inventory, avoiding her gaze. He arranged the boat, the initial documentation for Alexander Reed. "And he never told anyone? Not even your mother?" Nico's hands stilled. "My mother knows I'm alive." The revelation hit Mariella like a physical blow. "Sophia knows? All this time?" "Not at first," he clarified quickly. "I contacted her 3 months ago, when I was certain it was safe. She deserved to know." "She deserved to know," Mariella repeated, the words Lao. "But I didn't." Nico finally looked at her, regret etched in the lines around his eyes. "It wasn't about deserving, Mari. It was about risk. My mother lives under constant surveillance, by my father, by Dante. Contacting her was dangerous enough. But you?" He hesitated. "You were at the center of everything, watched by everyone." "Because I was grieving you," she countered, anger flaring. "Because I was vulnerable without your protection." "I know." He set down the gun he'd been checking, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so familiar it made her chest ache. "I made mistakes. Terrible ones. But at the time I thought I was protecting you. By leaving me to your brother's tender mercies." The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable. "I never thought Dante would—" He stopped, reconsidering. "No, that's not true. I knew exactly what Dante would do. I just thought you were strong enough to handle him." "I was. I am." Mariella stood, needing to move, to put distance between them in the confined space. "But that doesn't make your abandonment any less cruel." Nico watched her pace, his expression unreadable. "What do you want from me, Mari? An apology? I've given you that. Explanations? I've tried. What more can I offer?" "The truth," she said simply. "All of it. No more convenient omissions, no more protecting me from information you think I can't handle." He considered this, then nodded slowly. "All right. The whole truth." He gestured to the cot. You might want to sit down. This will take a while. Mariella reclaimed her seat, watching as Nico pulled a metal folding chair from against the wall and positioned it across from her. Close enough for conversation, far enough to respect the emotional distance between them. After Ricci approached me with his claims about your father's murder, I started investigating independently, he began. What I found, it wasn't just about Antonio. It was about a pattern of betrayal within the family going back decades. He reached for his backpack, removing a worn leather journal. This belonged to my grandfather, Salvatore Moretti, my father's father. He handed it to her. Read the entry from October 1985. Mariella opened the journal carefully, finding the date. The handwriting was spidery but legible. V has become a problem. His ambition exceeds his judgment. The Colombians offer a solution, but at what cost to the family? Better to handle it internally. A father should not outlive his son, but some sins cannot be forgiven. She looked up, confusion evident. Your grandfather was planning to have Vincent killed. Yes, but before he could act, he died suddenly. Heart attack officially. Nico's expression was grim. 3 weeks later, Vincent took control of the family, eliminating anyone who questioned his authority. You think Vincent killed his own father? I know he did. Nico leaned forward. There were rumors for years, but no proof, until I found this. He pulled out a yellowed photograph showing a much younger Vincent with a man Mariella didn't recognize. This is Vincent with Dr. Harold Weiss, the family physician who signed my grandfather's death certificate. 2 days after this picture was taken, Weiss disappeared. His body was found in the Hudson 3 months later. Mariella studied the photograph, mind racing. So Vincent has a history of eliminating obstacles within the family, including his own father. And potentially his own son, Nico added quietly. Me. Her eyes snapped to his. What? 2 weeks before my death, I overheard a conversation between my father and Dante. They didn't know I was there. His voice had gone flat, emotionless. My father told Dante that I was becoming a liability, that my ideas about legitimizing the business threatened everything he'd built, that it might be time for a change in succession planning. He was planning to kill you, Mariella whispered, the pieces falling into place. And then Ricci approached you with evidence about my father's murder. The timing wasn't coincidental, Nico confirmed. Ricci had sources inside our organization. He knew my father was turning against me, saw an opportunity to use me against Vincent. So your death wasn't just about protecting me from Ricci, it was about escaping your father. Both, he admitted. When Ricci threatened you, it was the catalyst I needed. I'd already been planning an exit strategy, but his threat accelerated everything. Mariella absorbed this, the revelation reshaping her understanding of the past 6 months. Why didn't you tell me this before, in Boston? Because it sounds like paranoia, he said simply. A son believing his father wants him dead, without concrete proof. I needed you to trust me first. And now? Do you have proof? Nico reached into his backpack again, removing a small digital recorder. This is the conversation I overheard. I started carrying this after I found my grandfather's journal, recording any meetings I wasn't supposed to be part of. He pressed play, and Vincent Moretti's distinctive voice filled the basement. Nico has become a problem. His talk of legitimate business, of stepping away from our core operations. It's weakness, Dante, weakness we cannot afford. Dante's voice responded. He's your son, father, your heir. And you are also my son, Vincent replied, one who understands what this family needs, what it takes to maintain our position. Perhaps it's time to reconsider the succession plan. What are you suggesting? Dante asked, his tone careful. I'm suggesting that accidents happen, Vincent said coldly, even to heirs apparent, especially those who spend so much time on boats. The recording ended, leaving a heavy silence in the basement. Mariella stared at Nico, seeing him with new eyes, not just as the man who had abandoned her, but as someone who had been fighting for survival on multiple fronts. "Your own father," she murmured. "And Dante." "Dante didn't explicitly agree," Nico said fairly, "but he didn't object either, and after my death, he stepped into my position without hesitation." "He mourned you," Mariella countered, remembering the funeral, "at least publicly." "Of course he did. Dante has always understood the importance of appearances." Nico's smile was bitter, just as he understood the advantage of consoling my grieving fiancé. The reminder of Dante's pursuit stung, though Mariella kept her expression neutral. "So what now? We have evidence that Vincent had my father killed, that he was planning to eliminate you. Where does that leave us?" "Vulnerable," Nico replied bluntly. "As long as Vincent and Dante control the organization, we're both targets. But we also have leverage, evidence that could destroy them if it reached the right people." "The FBI?" "Possibly, or the Commission. The other families wouldn't look kindly on Vincent killing his own father to take power. It violates the most basic principles of our world." Mariella considered this. The tactical part of her mind, the part her father had trained so carefully, assessing options and risks. "We need more than what we have. Recordings can be disputed, journals dismissed as fabrications. We need someone inside the organization willing to testify." "Ricci might be that person," Nico suggested, "if we can find him. And trust him," she added skeptically. "The man who threatened to kill me if you didn't cooperate with his vendetta." "We don't have to trust him. We just need to use him." Nico leaned forward, intensity in his gaze. "This is what I've been working toward for 6 months, Mary. Gathering evidence, building a case against my father and Dante. With your help, we could finally have enough to act." "My help," she repeated. "You want an alliance?" "Yes." He held her gaze steadily. "Not just for survival, but for justice. For your father. For what should have been your inheritance." The appeal was calculated, targeting exactly what would resonate most deeply with her. Mariella recognized the strategy. Nico had always been skilled at negotiation, at finding the precise leverage needed to secure agreement. "And what do you get out of this alliance?" she asked, needing to understand his motivation fully. "Freedom," he answered simply. "From my father's shadow, from the life he planned for me. And—" he hesitated, vulnerability flickering across his features. "A chance to make amends. For what I did to you." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, but Mariella had learned the hard way that sincerity and truth weren't always aligned. Nico believed what he was saying, that much was clear, but belief didn't guarantee accuracy or foresight. "I need time," she said finally, "to process all of this, to decide if I can trust you again." "We don't have much time," he reminded her gently. "Dante knows we're together. He'll have people searching every possible hiding place." "I'm not talking about days," she clarified. "Just space, to think clearly." Nico nodded, respecting her request by standing and moving toward the supplies again. "Frank left food in that cooler. We should eat something. It's been a long night." The mundane suggestion broke the tension, allowing them to shift from emotional confrontation to practical necessities. Mariella opened the cooler to find sandwiches, bottled water, and a few apples. Simple fare, but welcome after hours of adrenaline and revelation. They ate in relative silence, the basement single, bulb casting long shadows as night deepened outside. The chill of the concrete floor seeped through Mariella's boots, a physical reminder of their precarious situation. "There's a shower through that door," Nico said eventually, nodding toward a crude bathroom setup in the corner. "Hot water's limited, but it works." Mariella nodded gratefully, gathering her backpack. "I'll be quick." The bathroom was little more than a partitioned corner with a toilet, sink, and showerhead protruding from the wall over a drain in the floor. But the prospect of washing away the grime of their escape was too tempting to resist. Under the lukewarm spray, Mariella finally allowed herself to process the night's revelations. Vincent had ordered her father's murder, had planned to kill his own son, had built his empire on betrayal and patricide. And Nico, the man she had loved, mourned and now found again, had been fighting his own battle for survival, making desperate choices that had shattered her heart but potentially saved both their lives. Could she trust him again? The question echoed as she dried off with a threadbare towel. Trust wasn't a switch to be flipped, but a bridge to be rebuilt, plank by painful plank. When she emerged, dressed in clean clothes from her backpack, she found Nico had transformed the space as best he could. The cot now had a sleeping bag on it, a second one laid out on a foam pad on the floor. A battery-powered lantern provided softer light than the harsh overhead bulb. "I'll take the floor," he said, noticing her gaze on the makeshift beds. "Thank you." The simple courtesy touched her more than it should have. As Nico took his turn in the shower, Mariella settled on the cot, exhaustion finally catching up to her. The events of the past 24 hours played through her mind. Finding Nico in Boston, the evidence about her father, the shootout in the subway station, their narrow escape. And now they were here, fugitives together, forced into an alliance by circumstance and shared enemies. When Nico returned, hair damp and wearing a clean t-shirt and sweatpants, the domesticity of the moment struck her with unexpected force. How many times had they shared a bathroom, a bedroom, the simple rhythms of coexistence? The familiarity was both comforting and painful. "We should get some rest," he suggested, settling onto his sleeping bag. "Tomorrow we need to plan our next move." Mariella nodded, lying down and pulling the sleeping bag around her. The cot was uncomfortable, the basement cold, but physical discomfort was the least of her concerns. "Nico," she said into the darkness after he'd turned off the lantern, "if we do this, if we form this alliance, I need something from you." "Name it," he replied, his voice floating up from the floor. "No more secrets, no more unilateral decisions about my safety, my future. We operate as equals or not at all." The silence stretched long enough that she wondered if he'd fallen asleep. Then, "Equals," he agreed softly. "I promise." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But as Mariella drifted towards sleep, she acknowledged it was a beginning. A reluctant alliance born of necessity and shared purpose. Whether it could become something more remained to be seen. Chapter 6. Dangerous Reunion. Providence at night was a study in contrasts. The elegant colonial architecture of College Hill juxtaposed against the industrial grit of the waterfront. It was toward the latter that Frank's ancient pickup truck rumbled, Nico at the wheel, Mariella scanning the streets for any sign of surveillance. "Turn left at the next intersection," she directed, consulting the crude map Frank had drawn. "The address should be 2 blocks down, on the right." Nico complied, his expression tense in the glow of passing streetlights. They'd left Frank's basement hideout 3 hours earlier, taking a circuitous route to avoid main highways and potential checkpoints. The truck, rusted, nondescript with Rhode Island plates, was unlikely to attract attention, but both remained vigilant. "There," Mariella pointed to a weathered 3-story building wedged between a shuttered machine shop and a warehouse. No sign indicated its purpose, but a dim light glowed behind drawn blinds on the 2nd floor. Nico parked half a block away, killing the engine. "Remember the plan. We go in together, present our case and leave together, regardless of the outcome." "I remember," she affirmed, checking her weapon one last time before concealing it beneath her jacket. The building's entrance was unmarked, the door secured with a heavy deadbolt. Nico knocked in a specific pattern, 3 quick raps, a pause, then 2 more. The same sequence Mariella had used at his hotel room in Boston, she realized. A code from their shared past. Long moments passed before they heard movement inside. Then the scrape of multiple locks being disengaged, and the door opened a crack, revealing a sliver of a face, dark eyes, weathered skin, deep suspicion. "Who sent you?" a gravelly voice demanded. "Frank Russo," Nico replied. "We're here to see Marco Vannucci." The eyes narrowed further. "Marco doesn't see anyone without an appointment." Tell him Antonio DeLuca's daughter is here, Mariella interjected. And Nicolò Moretti. A sharp intake of breath, then, wait here. The door closed, locks engaging once more. Mariella and Nico exchanged glances, both aware of the risk they were taking. Marco Vannucci had been one of Antonio DeLuca's closest associates before switching allegiance to the Moretti family after Antonio's death. If anyone knew Ricci's whereabouts, it would be Marco. But his loyalty was an open question. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity before the door opened again, wider this time. The man who had answered, stocky, balding, with the hard eyes of a career enforcer, gestured them inside. Weapons, he demanded, holding out a hand. After we see Marco, Nico countered smoothly. Professional courtesy. The man scowled but didn't insist, instead leading them up a narrow staircase to the second floor. The space opened into what had once been a factory floor, now converted into a combination living area and office. Mismatched furniture, filing cabinets, and a large desk dominated the space. Behind the desk sat Marco Vannucci. At 65, Marco retained the powerful build of his younger days, though his once black hair had gone silver. His face was a map of hard living, deep lines around eyes that had seen too much, a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, another peeking from the collar of his shirt. Mariella DeLuca, he greeted, rising from his chair. You have your father's eyes. His gaze shifted to Nico, hardening instantly. And you, the dead Moretti prince, not so dead after all. Hello, Marco, Nico replied evenly. Thank you for seeing us. Marco gestured to the chairs opposite his desk. Sit. Explain why I shouldn't call Dante right now and collect whatever bounty he's put on your heads. They sat, Mariella maintaining a calm exterior despite the threat. Because you were loyal to my father once, before you switched sides. I was loyal to a dead man, Marco corrected. In our business, that's a luxury few can afford. And now, she pressed, where do your loyalties lie? Marco studied her, something like respect flickering in his eyes. To myself, to survival, the Moretti organization provides both. What if there was an alternative? Nico suggested. A way to honor old loyalties without sacrificing new ones? Marco leaned back, skepticism evident. I'm listening. Nico glanced at Mariella, deferring to her. It was a small gesture, but a significant one, acknowledging that in this negotiation her connection to Antonio carried more weight than his Moretti name. We have evidence, she began, that Vincent Moretti ordered my father's murder, that the Colombian hit was arranged by Vincent himself, not a territorial dispute as everyone was led to believe. Marco's expression remained neutral, but his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the arms of his chair. Evidence? Bank transfers, phone records between Vincent and Carlos Vega in the weeks before my father's death. Mariella held his gaze steadily. And testimony from someone who was there. Who? That's what we're here to discuss, Nico interjected. We're looking for Salvatore Ricci. The name hung in the air between them, charged with unspoken history. Marco's eyes narrowed, calculating. Ricci, he repeated slowly. Haven't heard that name in years. Don't insult our intelligence, Mariella said, an edge entering her voice. We know he's been active in Providence, building alliances, preparing for something. And if he is, Marco challenged, what business is that of yours? He approached me last year, Nico explained. Claimed to have evidence about Antonio's murder, wanted my help exposing Vincent. Which you refused, Marco surmised. At first, Nico acknowledged. Then circumstances changed. Marco's gaze shifted between them, understanding dawning. The explosion, your death, it was staged. Yes. Because Vincent was planning to have you killed too, Marco concluded, the pieces falling into place. Like father, like son, eliminating threats within the family. The accuracy of his assessment confirmed what Mariella had suspected. Marco knew far more than he was admitting. We need to find Ricci, she pressed. Compare what he knows with what we've discovered. Build a case strong enough to bring Vincent down. And then what? Marco challenged. You think the commission will just let you dismantle the Moretti organization, That Dante will accept his father's downfall quietly? No, Mariella replied honestly. But my father built something valuable before Vincent destroyed it. With the right leadership, those pieces could be reassembled. Your leadership, Marco stated, not a question. With the right allies, she confirmed, the implication clear. Marco stood, moving to a window that overlooked the darkened street below. For long moments he simply stared out, considering. When he turned back, his expression had shifted subtly. Ricci is a dangerous man, he said finally. More dangerous than when you knew him, Mariella. Betrayal and exile change people, rarely for the better. We understand the risk, Nico assured him. Do you? Marco's gaze was piercing. Ricci has spent years building a network independent of the traditional families. He's not interested in taking a seat at the old table. He wants to burn it down and build a new one. Where can we find him? Mariella asked directly. Marco hesitated, then seemed to reach a decision. There's a club in Federal Hill, the Blue Room. Ricci doesn't go there himself, but his lieutenant, Carlo Esposito, holds court there most nights. If anyone can arrange a meeting, it's Carlo. Thank you, Mariella said sincerely. Don't thank me yet, Marco warned. I haven't decided whether I'm helping you or sending you to your deaths. He moved back to his desk, writing something on a slip of paper. Give this to Carlo. It might keep him from killing you on sight. Nico took the paper, glancing at the single word written there before tucking it away. We appreciate the risk you're taking, Marco. One more thing, Marco said as they stood to leave. Vincent doesn't know I'm in Providence. I'd like to keep it that way. Of course, Mariella agreed. At the door, Marco stopped her with a light touch on her arm. You look like him, you know. Antonio, same determination in the eyes. His expression softened momentarily. He would be proud of the woman you've become. The unexpected sentiment caught her off guard, emotion tightening her throat. Thank you. Outside, back in the truck, Mariella finally asked the question that had been bothering her. What was on the paper? Nico started the engine before answering. Redemption. Just that one word. What does it mean? I don't know, he admitted. But Marco clearly thought it would matter to Carlo. They drove in silence toward Federal Hill, the Italian neighborhood that had once been the heart of organized crime in Providence. The Blue Room was tucked away on a side street, its entrance marked only by a small blue neon sign. We should establish a signal, Nico said as he parked, in case things go wrong inside. Sunrise, Mariella suggested. If either of us says that word, we leave immediately, no questions asked. He nodded agreement. Ready? As I'll ever be. The club was dimly lit, smoky despite Rhode Island's indoor smoking ban, and half full despite the late hour. A jazz quartet played in one corner, the music low enough to allow conversation. The clientele was mixed. Some clearly connected, others civilians enjoying the illicit thrill of drinking in a known mob hangout. Mariella scanned the room, her gaze settling on a booth in the back where 3 men sat, one older and 2 younger, all with the unmistakable bearing of made men. The older man, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, was holding court, the others listening with deference. Carlo, Nico murmured, following her gaze. The one in the center. They approached the bar first, ordering drinks they had no intention of consuming. The bartender, a heavy-set man with watchful eyes, studied them with open suspicion. We're here to see Carlo, Mariella said quietly. Marco Vannucci sent us. The bartender's expression didn't change, but he gave a slight nod toward a burly man standing near the booth. Talk to Frankie. They made their way across the room, drinks in hand, aware of the eyes tracking their movement. Frankie stepped forward as they approached, one hand casually inside his jacket. Private party, he said, his voice flat. We have a message from Marco Vannucci, Nico replied, keeping his tone respectful. For Carlo Esposito. Frankie's eyes narrowed. What message? Nico produced the slip of paper. Just this. The man took it, glanced at the single word, then looked back at them with new interest. "Wait here." He approached the booth, leaning down to speak quietly to Carlo. The older man's gaze shifted to them, sharp and assessing. After a moment he nodded and Frankie returned. 5 minutes, he said, gesturing toward the booth. "Hands where we can see them." They slid into the booth opposite Carlo, the two younger men moving to stand guard nearby. Up close, Carlo Esposito was more imposing than he had appeared from across the room, not physically large, but radiating the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Marco Vannucci," he said, his accent still carrying traces of his Sicilian origins. "A name I haven't heard in some time, and now he sends me Antonio DeLuca's daughter and Nicolò Moretti, back from the dead." He smiled thinly. "An interesting evening?" "Thank you for seeing us," Mariella said. Carlo waved a dismissive hand. "Marco's message brought you this conversation, nothing more." He leaned forward slightly. "What do you want with me?" "We're looking for Salvatore Ricci," Nico said directly. Carlo's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Ricci is not a man people find. He finds them when it suits him." "It would suit him to meet with us," Mariella countered. "We have evidence about my father's murder, evidence that implicates Vincent Moretti directly." "Evidence," Carlo repeated, skepticism evident. "The kind that would stand up in court, or the kind that gets people killed for possessing it?" "Both," Nico replied. "Bank records, phone logs, witness testimony, enough to bring Vincent down, through the commission or through the feds." Carlo studied them for a long moment, then signaled to one of his men. The younger man approached, leaning down to receive whispered instructions before disappearing toward the back of the club. "Why come to Ricci now?" Carlo asked, returning his attention to them. "After all this time?" "Because Vincent was planning to have me killed next," Nico explained. "Just like he had Antonio killed. Just like he had his own father killed." Carlo's eyebrows rose slightly at this last revelation. "Bold claims." "Documented ones," Mariella corrected. "We have my grandfather Salvatore's journal, records of payments to the doctor who falsified his death certificate." "And you want what? Ricci's help bringing Vincent down?" "We want to compare notes," Mariella said carefully. "Ricci approached Nico last year with evidence about my father's murder. We've gathered more since then. Together it might be enough to act decisively." "Act how?" Carlo pressed. "What's your endgame?" Mariella met his gaze directly. "Justice for my father, a reckoning for Vincent, and afterward a reorganization of what remains, legitimate businesses, clean operations, a sustainable future." Carlo laughed, the sound genuinely amused. "You sound like your fiancé, always dreaming of going legitimate." He shook his head. "Our world doesn't work that way, Miss DeLuca. Blood demands blood. Vengeance, not transformation." "Then Ricci and I want different things," she acknowledged. "But we can still help each other achieve our immediate goals." The man Carlo had sent away returned, whispering in his ear. Carlo nodded, then turned back to them. "It seems you've piqued some interest," he said. "Finish your drinks and follow Frankie. He'll take you somewhere more private." Alarm bells rang in Mariella's mind. This was moving too quickly, too smoothly. She caught Nico's eye, seeing the same wariness reflected there. "We appreciate the opportunity," Nico said carefully. "But perhaps we could arrange a meeting for tomorrow. Give everyone time to prepare." Carlo's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Ricci's schedule is unpredictable. Tonight is what's available." The implicit threat was clear, now or never. Mariella took a calculated risk. "We'll need assurances of safe passage, both to and from the meeting." "Of course," Carlo agreed, too readily. "Frankie will ensure your safety personally." They had little choice. Refusing now would close this avenue permanently, and they had no other leads to Ricci. Mariella nodded her agreement, feeling the weight of the Glock at her back as a small comfort. Frankie led them through the kitchen and out a back door to where a black SUV waited, engine running. Another man stood beside it, opening the rear door as they approached. After you, Frankie said, gesturing to the open door. Nico hesitated. Where are we going? Not far, Frankie replied, his patience clearly wearing thin. Mr. Ricci values his privacy. They exchanged a glance, a silent communication passing between them. If this was a trap, they were walking into it willingly. But if it wasn't, if Ricci truly was willing to meet, this might be their only chance. Mariella entered the SUV first, sliding across the leather seat. Nico followed, positioning himself so that his right hand could reach his weapon if necessary. Frankie got in beside them, while the other man took the driver's seat. As the SUV pulled away from the club, Mariella noted their route, identifying landmarks, calculating distances. Old habits from her father's training: always know where you are, always have an escape plan. They drove for 15 minutes, leaving Federal Hill and heading toward the industrial area near the port. The SUV finally stopped outside a warehouse that appeared abandoned, windows boarded, chain-link fence surrounding the property. "End of the line," Frankie announced, opening his door. "Out!" The warehouse interior was cavernous, mostly empty except for stacks of crates along one wall and a makeshift office constructed of plywood partitions in the center of the space. Harsh fluorescent lights cast everything in an unflattering glare. 4 armed men stood at strategic points around the room, their weapons visible but not aimed. A clear show of force. Frankie led them toward the office, knocking once before opening the door. "They're here," he announced to someone inside. "Send them in," a voice replied. "Alone." Frankie stepped back, gesturing for them to enter. Mariella went first, Nico close behind, both acutely aware that they were now separated from their only exit by multiple armed men. The office was sparsely furnished: a metal desk, 3 chairs, a filing cabinet. Behind the desk sat Salvatore Ricci. At 68, Ricci was lean and hard, his face deeply lined, his hair white but still thick. He wore a simple black suit, no tie, his only concession to luxury the gold watch on his wrist. His eyes, dark, intelligent, unforgiving, fixed on them with predatory focus. "Nicolò Moretti," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp, "back from the dead, and Mariella DeLuca." His gaze lingered on her. "You look like your father." "Mr. Ricci," Mariella acknowledged, remaining standing. "Thank you for meeting with us." "Sit," he instructed, gesturing to the chairs. "Let's not waste time with pleasantries. You have evidence about Vincent Moretti. I want to see it." Nico removed a flash drive from his pocket, placing it on the desk. "Everything we have. Bank records showing payments to Carlos Vega before Antonio's murder, phone logs, surveillance photos of Vincent meeting with Vega 3 days before the hit." Ricci picked up the drive but didn't immediately review its contents. "And what do you want in exchange for this?" "Your testimony," Mariella replied. "Your corroboration of what we've found. And any additional evidence you have that we don't." "To what end?" Ricci asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "To bring Vincent down," Nico said. "Through the commission, through law enforcement, whatever works." Ricci leaned back in his chair, studying them. "And after Vincent falls? What then?" "A reorganization," Mariella answered. "My father's original crew combined with elements of the Moretti organization that remain viable." "Under your leadership," Ricci stated, not a question. "Yes." A thin smile spread across Ricci's face. "Antonio would be proud. He always said you had more steel in you than most made men." The smile faded. "But you're naive if you think the Commission will allow you to simply step into power, or that Dante will accept his father's downfall quietly." "We're prepared for resistance," Nico assured him. "Are you?" Ricci's gaze sharpened. "Because from where I sit, you're 2 people with a flash drive, no crew, no territory, and no standing in our world. One of you is legally dead, the other is engaged to marry the very man you're plotting against." The accuracy of his assessment was unsettling. Mariella leaned forward slightly. "That's why we need allies. People who knew my father, who respected him. People like you." Ricci was silent for a long moment, considering. Then he opened a drawer and removed a file folder, placing it on the desk between them. "Antonio gave me this the week before he died," he said. "Insurance, he called it. Evidence of Vincent's other eliminations. 3 captains who questioned his authority after Salvatore's death. Proof of his involvement in territory disputes that cost dozens of lives. A record of bribes to judges, police captains, union officials." Mariella reached for the folder, but Ricci placed his hand on it, stopping her. "This doesn't leave with you," he said firmly. "Not yet. I need to verify what you've brought me first. Confirm it matches what I already know." "How long will that take?" Nico asked. "A day, maybe 2. Ricci inserted the flash drive into a laptop on his desk. "I'll contact you when I've reviewed everything." "How?" Mariella pressed. "We're not exactly easy to reach at the moment." Ricci wrote a number on a slip of paper and slid it across the desk. "Burner phone. Call tomorrow night, 8 p.m. We'll arrange the next meeting then." It wasn't ideal, but it was progress. Mariella took the paper, memorizing the number before tucking it away. "One more thing," Ricci said as they stood to leave. "Dante knows you're in Providence. He's had men watching the Blue Room for days." Alarm shot through Mariella. "How? Your detective friend in Boston," Ricci explained. "Sullivan. He's been playing both sides for years. Told Dante about your inquiries regarding me." The betrayal stung, though it shouldn't have surprised her. In their world, loyalty was always contingent, always negotiable. "We need to move," Nico said urgently. "If Dante's men saw us at the club—" "They did," Ricci confirmed. "Which is why you're not leaving the way you came in." He pressed a button on his desk, and a door at the back of the office swung open, revealing a corridor. "This leads to the loading dock. There's a car waiting. Keys in the ignition, registration in the glove box. Ditch it once you're clear of the city." "Why help us?" Mariella asked, suspicious of this sudden cooperation. Ricci's expression hardened. "Because Vincent Moretti killed my best friend. Because he dismantled everything Antonio built and absorbed it into his own operation. Because he's a cancer in our world, and it's time to cut him out." He stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "Go, and be more careful about who you trust going forward." They moved quickly through the corridor, emerging onto a loading dock where, as promised, a nondescript sedan waited. Nico checked it for tracking devices or explosives, a precaution that would have seemed paranoid in any other context, before they got in. As they drove away from the warehouse, Mariella's mind raced with implications and contingencies. If Sullivan betrayed us, we need to assume Dante knows everything. About the evidence, about our plans. "Not everything," Nico countered, navigating through the dark streets away from the port. "Sullivan didn't know about Ricci's file, or about my grandfather's journal. Still, we can't go back to Frank's, it's not safe." "Agreed." Nico checked the rearview mirror, ensuring they weren't being followed. "We need to get out of Providence, head north maybe, New Hampshire or Maine." Mariella nodded, already calculating distances, safe houses, resources. "We should separate the evidence, keep copies in different locations. If one of us is caught—" "Neither of us is getting caught," Nico interrupted firmly. "We stay together from now on." The intensity in his voice made her look at him sharply. "That's not tactical. If we separate, this isn't just about tactics anymore, Marie." His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "I lost you once. I'm not doing it again." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, charged with everything they hadn't resolved, everything they might never have the chance to resolve if Dante found them first. Before Mariella could respond, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, approaching rapidly. Too rapidly for normal traffic at this hour. "We've got company," Nico said grimly, accelerating. 2 vehicles coming up fast." Mariella turned to look. 2 black SUVs, identical to the one that had brought them to the warehouse. Ricci's men? Or Dante's? Nico took a sharp turn onto a side street. Either way, they're not here for a friendly chat. The SUVs followed, gaining ground. Mariella drew her weapon, checking the clip. "How far to the highway?" "Too far. They'll catch us before we get there." Nico's mind worked rapidly, assessing options. Industrial area ahead. Lots of warehouses, loading docks. Places to lose them or make a stand if we have to. He took another turn, then another, trying to put distance between them and their pursuers. The sedan was faster than it looked, but the SUVs had power and weight on their side. They were closing the gap. There, Mariella pointed to a construction site ahead, a half-finished building surrounded by equipment and materials. Tight spaces, multiple levels, we can lose them on foot. Nico nodded, swerving toward the site entrance. He cut the headlights as they passed through the gate, plunging them into darkness broken only by the distant glow of city lights. They abandoned the car behind a stack of concrete barriers, moving quickly toward the skeletal structure of the building. Behind them, the SUVs entered the site, headlights sweeping across the construction equipment as they searched. Up, Nico directed, leading the way to a temporary staircase that zigzagged up the side of the building. Second level. We'll have better visibility, more options. They climbed rapidly, keeping low to avoid being silhouetted against the night sky. The second level was a maze of steel beams, half-installed flooring and stacked materials, perfect for cover, for ambush if necessary. Below, men emerged from the SUVs, 6 in total, all armed, spreading out to search the site. Mariella and Nico crouched behind a pallet of cinder blocks, watching. Dante's men, Nico whispered, recognizing 2 of them. Marco and Vito from the hotel in Boston. They must have been watching the Blue Room, Mariella concluded. Followed us to the warehouse, then picked up our trail when we left. Which means they don't know about Ricci's file yet. Nico checked his weapon. We need to keep it that way. The men below were methodical, working in pairs to search the site. It wouldn't be long before they found the abandoned car, then followed their trail to the building. We need to thin them out, Mariella said, tactical mind engaging. Divide their attention. Nico nodded agreement. I'll circle around to the east side, create a distraction. When they move to investigate, you head for the north exit. There's a fence, but it's climbable. And then what? We're still on foot in an industrial area in the middle of the night. One problem at a time, Nico replied grimly. First, we survive this. He started to move away, but Mariella caught his arm. Be careful, she said, the words inadequate for everything she wanted to express. Nico's expression softened momentarily. You too. He disappeared into the shadows, moving silently across the unfinished floor. Mariella counted seconds in her head, giving him time to get into position. Below, the searchers were getting closer to their abandoned car. A crash from the far side of the building shattered the night, Nico's distraction. The searchers reacted immediately, 4 of them running toward the sound, weapons drawn. 2 remained near the vehicles, watching the perimeter. Mariella moved quickly toward the north side of the building, staying low, using the construction materials for cover. The staircase on this side was incomplete, ending at a platform 10 feet above the ground. She'd have to jump. She was halfway down when a shout went up. Someone had spotted her. A shot rang out, the bullet striking metal near her head. Mariella ducked, returning fire to force her attacker to cover. More shots echoed across the site, Nico engaging the men who had responded to his distraction. Mariella reached the platform, assessing the drop. Not ideal, but survivable. She holstered her weapon and lowered herself over the edge, hanging by her hands to reduce the distance before dropping. She landed hard, pain shooting through her ankle, but kept moving, limping toward the fence. Behind her, footsteps pounded as one of the men gave chase. The fence loomed ahead, chain link, topped with barbed wire. Mariella reached it just as another shot rang out, this one closer. She began to climb, ignoring the pain in her ankle, focusing only on escape. She was nearly at the top when she heard Nico shout her name, a warning. She turned to see one of Dante's men taking aim, too close to miss. She froze, caught on the fence, nowhere to go. A shot cracked through the night air, but it wasn't from her pursuer. The man jerked, then crumpled to the ground. Nico appeared from the shadows, weapon still raised. Go! He shouted, already turning to face new threats approaching from the building. Mariella hesitated for only a second before continuing over the fence, careful of the barbed wire at the top. She dropped to the other side just as more gunfire erupted behind her. "Nico!" she called, unable to see him in the darkness. No response. Just more gunfire, shouts, the sound of running feet. She had to make a choice, go back, potentially into a trap, or follow the plan and get clear. Training warred with emotion, duty with desire. Training won. She turned and ran, disappearing into the maze of warehouses and loading docks that lined the street, the sounds of conflict fading behind her. She would circle back, find a vantage point, assess the situation. She would not abandon Nico, not again, not ever. But neither would she throw away the advantage his sacrifice had brought her by rushing back blindly. As she moved through the shadows, one thought burned in her mind. If Dante's men had hurt Nico, there would be no place in this world they could hide from her vengeance. The hunt had become a war, and Mariella DeLuca was her father's daughter. She knew how to fight, how to survive, how to win, even if winning came at a terrible cost. Chapter 7. The Final Confrontation. The Moretti family compound in Westchester loomed against the twilight sky, its stone walls and wrought-iron gates a physical manifestation of the barrier between the family and the outside world. From their vantage point in the dense woods that bordered the property, Mariella and Nico observed the security patterns they'd once taken for granted. Armed guards patrolling the perimeter, cameras monitoring every approach, the occasional guard dog making rounds with its handler. "Security's been doubled since we were last here," Nico noted, lowering his binoculars. "Dante's not taking any chances." Mariella checked her watch. 7:15 p.m. "The shift change happens at 7:30. That's our window." They'd spent the past week meticulously planning this confrontation, gathering allies, securing evidence, and preparing contingencies. After their narrow escape from Ricci's men in Providence and Nico's recovery from his wounds, they'd reached a critical decision. They couldn't keep running. The only path forward was through Dante and the truth he'd been concealing. "Are you sure about this?" Nico asked, studying her profile in the gathering darkness. "Once we're inside, there's no turning back." Mariella met his gaze, her expression resolute. "I've never been more certain of anything. Dante has answers we need, and tonight he's going to provide them." The plan was audacious in its simplicity. They would enter through the service tunnel that connected the main house to the garage, a passage known only to family members and their most trusted associates. Once inside, they would confront Dante in his study, where he worked late most evenings. The evidence they'd gathered, combined with Detective Sullivan's cooperation, ensured that police would raid the compound precisely 1 hour after they entered, enough time to get what they needed from Dante before chaos erupted. "Sullivan confirmed the warrant's been signed," Nico verified, checking his weapon one last time. "Yes, Judge Harrington approved it this morning. The FBI and state police are staging 5 miles from here, waiting for Sullivan's signal." Mariella adjusted her tactical vest beneath her black jacket. "They're expecting to find evidence of racketeering, money laundering and conspiracy to commit murder." "Which they will," Nico confirmed grimly. "The files we provided Sullivan contain enough to put Dante away for decades." "If everything goes according to plan," Mariella's tone was pragmatic. In their world, plans rarely survived first contact with reality. Nico reached for her hand, squeezing it briefly. "Whatever happens in there, Murray, I want you to know." "Don't," she interrupted, her voice softening despite her resolve. "No goodbyes. We're both walking out of there tonight." The certainty in her voice almost made him believe it was possible. At precisely 7:28, they moved. Using the cover of darkness and the distraction of the shift change, they slipped through a blind spot in the camera coverage that Nico had identified years earlier. The service tunnel entrance was concealed behind a false panel in the garage's back wall, a security measure designed to provide the family an escape route that had now become their point of entry. The tunnel was narrow, damp, and lit only by emergency lights that cast long shadows as they moved silently toward the main house. At the end, another panel opened into a utility room adjacent to the kitchen. Nico pressed his ear against the door, listening for movement before easing it open. The kitchen. Chapter 7. The Final Confrontation continued. The kitchen was empty, the staff having finished dinner service and retired to their quarters. Mariella and Nico moved through the familiar space with practiced stealth, avoiding the creaking floorboard near the pantry, staying clear of the motion sensors that guarded the main hallway. Dante's study is on the second floor, east wing, Nico whispered, though he knew Mariella remembered the layout as well as he did. At this hour he'll be alone. Vincent takes his brandy in the library after dinner. They ascended the service staircase, pausing at each landing to listen for movement. The house felt unnaturally quiet, the usual bustle of staff and security conspicuously absent. "Something's wrong," Mariella murmured, instincts prickling. "Where is everyone?" Nico frowned, sharing her concern. Maybe Vincent called a meeting elsewhere, or... A soft click behind them cut him off, the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. "Or perhaps we were expecting you," came Dante's smooth voice from the shadows. They turned slowly, hands raised, to find Dante Moretti standing at the top of the stairs, a silenced Beretta aimed steadily at them. He looked exactly as Mariella remembered, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, dark hair perfectly styled, his handsome features arranged in an expression of mild amusement. "Hello, brother," Nico said evenly. "Still hiding in shadows, I see." "Says the man who faked his own death." Dante's gaze shifted to Mariella, something possessive flickering in his eyes. "And my fiancé. How touching that you've reunited just in time for me to kill you both." "I was never your fiancé, Dante," Mariella replied coldly. "I was playing you, just as you played me." A flash of genuine anger crossed his features before the mask of control returned. "Into the study. Now. Father will want to hear this." They had no choice but to comply, moving ahead of Dante down the hallway to the study door. Nico pushed it open to reveal Vincent Moretti seated behind the massive oak desk, looking older than Mariella remembered but no less formidable. His massive frame still commanded respect. His eyes still held the cold calculation that had built and maintained his empire. "Nicolò," he greeted, as if welcoming a son who had merely been away on business. "I always suspected you might have survived. Too clever by half, just like your grandfather." "Hello, father," Nico replied, his voice neutral despite the tension radiating from him. Vincent's gaze shifted to Mariella. "And Miss DeLuca. I must say your performance these past months has been impressive. I almost believed you had accepted Dante as a suitable replacement for my wayward son." "I learned from the best," she replied. "You've been performing all my life, pretending to honor my father's memory while knowing you ordered his execution." If Vincent was surprised by her directness, he didn't show it. He merely gestured to the chairs opposite his desk. "Sit. Since you've gone to such trouble to arrange this reunion, we might as well be civilized about it." Dante closed the door, keeping his weapon trained on them as they sat. He took up position beside his father, the united front of Moretti power. "I assume you have some purpose beyond suicidal nostalgia," Vincent said, steepling his fingers. "Some evidence you believe is damning enough to justify this intrusion." "We have everything," Nico stated flatly. "Bank transfers to Carlos Vega before Antonio's hit, phone records, surveillance photos of your meeting with Vega 3 days before Antonio died." "And Salvatore Ricci's testimony," Mariella added. "He was there when you gave the order, he heard everything." Vincent's expression remained impassive, but a muscle twitched in his jaw, a tell Nico recognized from childhood confrontations. "Ricci," he repeated, the name like poison on his tongue. "Antonio's dog, still yapping after all these years." "He's more than yapping," Mariella countered. "He's provided sworn testimony to the FBI. Combined with the financial evidence and Detective Sullivan's cooperation, it's enough for the RICO case that's being built against you right now." Dante laughed, the sound sharp with disbelief. "Sullivan? He works for us." "He worked for you," Nico corrected, "until we showed him evidence that you were planning to eliminate him after he handled Mariella. Self-preservation is a powerful motivator, brother." Uncertainty flickered across Dante's face as he looked to his father for confirmation. Vincent's expression had hardened, his calculating mind visibly reassessing the situation. "Even if what you say is true," Vincent said carefully, "you've made a critical error in coming here. Whatever evidence exists, whatever testimony Ricci has provided, none of it matters if you don't leave this room alive." "That's where you're wrong," Mariella replied, allowing herself a small smile. "The FBI and state police are moving on this compound in exactly," she checked her watch, "43 minutes. Whether we're alive or dead when they arrive, the evidence against you both is already in their hands." Vincent's composure slipped for the first time, genuine surprise registering before he controlled it. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Mariella held his gaze steadily. "You taught me never to enter a negotiation without leverage, Vincent. Or rather, my father taught me that before you had him killed." The room fell silent as Vincent considered his options, the only sound the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, a new calculation evident in his eyes. "What do you want?" he asked directly. "You didn't come here just to watch us be arrested. You want something." "The truth," Nico said simply, "about Antonio, about grandfather, about why you were planning to have me killed next." Vincent studied his son for a long moment, something like respect flickering in his gaze. "The truth," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "Very well, you've earned that much." He reached for the crystal decanter on his desk, pouring himself a measure of scotch with steady hands. "Antonio DeLuca was my friend, my brother in all but blood. And yes, I ordered his death." He took a sip, savoring the liquor. "Because he was planning to betray me, to take half my territory, my men, my connections, and establish his own organization." "He wanted legitimacy," Mariella countered. "Clean businesses, legal operations, not betrayal." "Legitimacy," Vincent scoffed. "A fantasy. There is no legitimate path from where we stand. Antonio knew that. His talk of going clean was a cover for his real ambition, to replace me as the dominant power in New York." "And my grandfather?" Nico pressed. "Did he share this dangerous ambition for legitimacy?" Vincent's expression darkened. "Salvatore was weak, sentimental. After your grandmother died, he lost his edge, started talking about legacy, about honor, about limits." His voice hardened. "There are no limits in our world, Nicolò. Only power and those too weak to seize it." "So you had your own father killed," Nico stated, the confirmation of his suspicions bringing no satisfaction. "Arranged a heart attack that no one questioned." "I did what was necessary to preserve what he built," Vincent corrected. "What I expanded, what you were too soft to maintain." "And that's why you planned to have me killed too," Nico concluded. "Because I shared grandfather's weakness, his desire for something better." Vincent didn't deny it. "You were becoming a liability. Your ideas about legitimate business, about stepping away from our core operations, they threatened everything. Dante at least understands what this family needs to survive." Dante straightened at this rare praise, pride evident in his posture. "I've always put family first, father. Always." "Yes," Vincent agreed, his gaze still fixed on Nico. "Your brother understands loyalty, understands sacrifice." "Sacrifice?" Mariella laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call ordering the deaths of your father and son? Murdering your closest friend?" "I call it necessity," Vincent replied coldly. "Something neither of you seems to comprehend." The clock on the mantel chimed the half-hour, 25 minutes until the raid. Mariella exchanged a glance with Nico, a silent communication passing between them. They had what they came for, Vincent's confession. Now they needed to survive long enough for it to matter. "You still haven't asked the most important question," Vincent observed, studying them with predatory focus. "How did we know you were coming tonight?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Mariella's mind raced through possibilities. A leak in Sullivan's department, surveillance they'd missed, a betrayal from one of their limited allies. "Ricci," Nico guessed, the realization dawning. "He played us." Vincent smiled thinly. Salvatore Ricci has been working for me for the past 3 years, ever since I offered him something more valuable than revenge. What could possibly be worth betraying everything he claimed to stand for? Mariella demanded. His son's life, Vincent replied simply. Carlo Esposito isn't just Ricci's lieutenant, he's his son. Born to a waitress Ricci knew in his youth, raised without knowing his true parentage until I arranged a DNA test and presented Ricci with the results. And the choice, work for me or watch Carlo die believing his father had a band. Won him twice. The revelation struck Mariella like a physical blow. Everything, their meeting with Carlo at the Blue Room, Ricci's convenient appearance, the file he'd shown them, had been orchestrated to lead them here to this moment. The FBI raid, she said, cold certainty settling in her stomach. It's not happening, is it? Detective Sullivan is indeed expecting a raid tonight, Dante confirmed, smirking. But not here. He's currently leading a task force to an empty warehouse in Queens, where they'll find nothing but their own embarrassment. The trap had closed around them perfectly. No backup coming. No evidence in law enforcement hands. Just the two of them against the full might of the Moretti organization. So what happens now? Nico asked, his voice steady despite the dire situation. You kill us both and go back to business as usual? Not quite, Vincent replied. Mariella still has value. Antonio's daughter, properly managed, could help consolidate certain alliances that have been strained since his death. Properly managed, Mariella repeated, disgust evident. You mean married to Dante, controlled through him? Precisely. Vincent nodded approvingly. You always were quick to understand the strategic play, just like your father. And Nico? She pressed, though she already knew the answer. My son died in a yacht explosion 6 months ago, Vincent said coldly. A tragic accident that the family has already mourned and moved beyond. Dante shifted his grip on the Beretta, anticipation evident in his posture. He'd been waiting for this moment, the chance to eliminate his brother permanently, to claim everything that should have been Nico's by birthright. Any last words, brother? He asked, raising the weapon. Just one question, Nico replied, his gaze fixed on his father rather than the gun aimed at his heart. Did you ever love us? Mother, Dante, me? Or were we just pieces on your chessboard? Something flickered in Vincent's eyes. Not quite regret, but perhaps recognition of what might have been in another life. I loved what you could become, he answered finally, what you could contribute to the legacy I built. That's not love, Nico said quietly. That's ownership. Vincent inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the distinction without accepting it. Goodbye, Nicolò. You were always too much like your grandfather for your own good. Dante steadied his aim, finger tightening on the trigger. Mariella tensed, preparing to launch herself forward in a desperate attempt to disrupt his shot. The study door burst open. Sophia Moretti stood in the doorway, elegant as always in a black evening dress, her silver-streaked dark hair swept up in its customary chignon. In her hand was a small revolver, pointed steadily at her husband. Put the gun down, Dante, she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of Moretti family politics. Dante froze, confusion evident. Mother? What are you doing? Something I should have done years ago. Sophia stepped into the room, her aim never wavering from Vincent. When you killed your father, I told myself it was necessary. When you ordered Antonio's death, I convinced myself it was business. But when you planned to murder our son, my son, you crossed a line I cannot forgive. Vincent's expression hardened. You're being emotional, Sophia. This doesn't concern you. Doesn't concern me, she repeated, incredulous. You plotted to kill our child, and it doesn't concern me. You've lost your mind, Vincent. Mother, Dante interjected, lowering his weapon slightly. Father was protecting the family. Nico was becoming a liability. Be quiet, Dante, Sophia snapped. You're as blind as he is. Do you think you're exempt? That once Nico was gone, your position would be secure? Your father eliminates anyone who threatens his control, even his own blood. Doubt crept into Dante's expression as he looked between his parents. Father? Vincent's face remained impassive, but his silence was damning. The raid may be a fiction, Sophia continued, addressing Mariella and Nico now. But the evidence isn't. I've spent the past 6 months gathering my own insurance. Bank records, witness testimonies, recordings of conversations Vincent thought were private. Sophia, Vincent warned, his voice dangerously low. Think carefully about what you're doing. I have thought carefully, she replied, her resolve evident. For 30 years I've thought carefully, weighed every word, every action. I've been the perfect wife, the silent partner, the mother who looked away when necessary. Her hand remained steady on the revolver. No more. She reached into a small evening bag with her free hand, removing a flash drive which she tossed to Nico. Everything is there, enough to destroy Vincent and protect you both, if you use it wisely. Nico caught the drive, disbelief and gratitude warring in his expression. Mother, there's no time, she cut him off. Security will have heard the commotion. You need to leave now. Take the passage behind the bookcase. It leads to the garage where I've left keys to the Bentley. Mariella stood, mind racing to adjust to this unexpected ally. Come with us, she urged. Once Vincent realizes what you've done. My place is here, Sophia interrupted firmly. Someone needs to ensure your escape, and I still have influence with the guards. Mother, please, Dante implored, finally grasping the magnitude of what was happening. This is madness. We're family. Yes, we are, Sophia agreed, her expression softening slightly as she looked at her younger son. Which is why I'm giving you a choice, Dante. You can leave with your brother and Mariella, start something new away from your father's shadow, or you can stay and share whatever fate awaits Vincent when the real authorities arrive. Real authorities? Vincent's composure finally cracked. What have you done, Sophia? I called in a favor with Judge Harrington, the real Judge Harrington, not whatever impersonator you arranged for your false raid. Sophia's smile was cold. The FBI will be here in 15 minutes, with a warrant signed by a federal judge and evidence provided anonymously over the past month. Vincent lunged for the desk drawer where Mariella knew he kept a backup weapon. Sophia fired without hesitation, the bullet striking his shoulder and spinning him back into his chair. The next one goes through your heart, she warned, her aim unwavering despite having just shot her husband. Nico, Mariella, go, now. Nico moved to the bookcase, finding the hidden latch that revealed the passage beyond. He turned back to his mother, conflict evident in his expression. I can't leave you here. You can and you will, Sophia replied firmly. I've made my choice. Now make yours. Live the life you wanted, the one your grandfather envisioned. Build something better than this. Mariella took Nico's hand, tugging him toward the passage. She's right. We have to go. Dante stood frozen, torn between the father he had emulated his entire life and the mother who had just offered him redemption. Blood seeped through Vincent's expensive suit jacket as he clutched his wounded shoulder, his eyes burning with a mixture of pain and fury. Dante? Sophia called softly. Choose. For a moment it seemed he might follow them. Then his expression hardened, his grip tightening on the Beretta as he raised it once more. I am a Moretti, he declared. My place is here, with father. Sophia's disappointment was palpable, but she nodded in acceptance. Then God help you both, she gestured urgently to Nico and Mariella. Go! They slipped into the passage, Nico pulling the bookcase closed behind them. The narrow corridor was dark, lit only by emergency lights along the baseboard. They moved quickly, following the passage as it sloped downward toward the garage level. Will she be all right? Mariella asked as they hurried through the darkness. I don't know, Nico admitted, his voice tight with emotion. She's survived 30 years with my father, but this is different. They emerged into the garage to find the Bentley waiting as promised, keys in the ignition. Nico slid behind the wheel while Mariella took the passenger seat, both scanning for security personnel. The main gate will be guarded, Nico said as he started the engine. We'll have to use the service entrance on the east side. Mariella nodded, checking her weapon. If we're stopped, we won't be stopped, Nico cut her off, determination hardening his features. We've come too far to fail now. He accelerated out of the garage, taking the curved driveway at dangerous speed. In the distance they could see the main gate with its guard post, 2 armed men visible even from this distance. Nico veered sharply onto a narrow access road that wound through the estate's extensive grounds. The Bentley's headlights illuminated the dense trees on either side as they sped toward the service entrance. A simple gate used primarily by groundskeepers and delivery vehicles. There, Mariella pointed to the gate ahead, relief flooding through her. We're almost... A black SUV appeared, blocking the narrow road. 2 men emerged, weapons drawn. Dante's men, Nico identified grimly, not slowing the Bentley. Hold on. He pressed the accelerator to the floor, the luxury sedan surging forward with unexpected power. The men dove out of the way as the Bentley crashed through the SUV, the impact jarring but not enough to stop their momentum. Metal screamed against metal as they forced their way past. The Bentley's front end crumpled, but the engine still running. They burst through the service gate, the flimsy chain giving way under the force of their passage. Nico fought to control the damaged vehicle as they fishtailed onto the county road beyond, tires squealing in protest. "Anyone behind us?" he asked, unable to see through the crumpled rear window. Mariella twisted in her seat, peering through the shattered glass. "Not yet, but they won't be far behind." Nico nodded, focusing on putting distance between them and the compound. The Bentley was damaged but still powerful, eating up the miles as they headed south toward the city. "Where are we going?" Mariella asked, the adrenaline of their escape beginning to ebb, leaving room for practical considerations. "I have a place in Brooklyn," Nico replied. "Under a name not even Dante knows. We'll be safe there while we decide our next move." Mariella nodded, her mind already racing ahead. "The flash drive. We need to see what's on it. Determine if it's enough to protect us long term." "And my mother," Nico added, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "We need to make sure she's safe." The unspoken question hung between them. What would happen to Sophia once the FBI arrived? Would she be arrested alongside Vincent and Dante? Would she face charges as an accessory to decades of Moretti crimes? "One step at a time," Mariella said gently, placing her hand over his on the gear shift. "First we get somewhere safe, then we assess what we have and plan our next move." Nico nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders at her touch. They drove in silence for several miles, the lights of Manhattan appearing on the horizon like a constellation of earthbound stars. "What my father said," Nico finally spoke, his voice quiet. "About Antonio planning to betray him. Do you think it was true?" Mariella considered the question carefully. "I think my father wanted something better for me, for all of us. Whether that meant breaking away from the Morettis or transforming the organization from within, I'll never know for certain." "And what do you want?" Nico asked, glancing at her briefly before returning his attention to the road. "After all this, if we survive, if we're free, what then?" It was the question she'd been avoiding since finding him alive in Chicago. The future that had once seemed so clear, then shattered, now potentially within reach again. "I want what my father wanted," she answered finally. "Something better, something sustainable. A life where we're not constantly looking over our shoulders, where every knock at the door doesn't bring the threat of arrest or assassination." "Legitimacy," Nico murmured, echoing their old dream. "Yes, but I'm not naive anymore," she continued. "I know the path from where we are to where we want to be isn't straight or simple. It will take time, careful planning, strategic alliances." "And us?" he asked, the question laden with everything they hadn't resolved. "Where do we stand in this new future?" Mariella looked at him, the man she had loved, mourned, found again. the man who had broken her heart in an attempt to save her life, the man who had just risked everything to expose the truth about her father's murder. "We stand together," she said simply. "Partners, equals, building something neither of us could create alone." It wasn't a declaration of love, not yet. That would take time, trust rebuilt slowly through actions rather than words. But it was a beginning, a foundation upon which something stronger might eventually grow. Nico nodded, understanding the boundaries she was establishing. "Partners," he agreed. "No more secrets, no more unilateral decisions. No more faking your death," she added, a hint of humor breaking through the tension. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I promise." They crossed the bridge into Brooklyn as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the first tentative rays illuminating a city that seemed somehow new, full of possibilities they hadn't dared imagine 24 hours earlier. The Bentley's engine finally gave out 3 blocks from their destination, forcing them to abandon it and continue on foot. Nico led the way through quiet streets to a nondescript brownstone on a tree-lined block. "Home sweet home," he said as he unlocked the front door, ushering her inside. "At least for now." The interior was simple but comfortable. Hardwood floors, minimal furniture, large windows that filled the space with morning light. It bore little resemblance to the luxury they'd both been accustomed to in their previous lives, but Mariella found she preferred its honest simplicity. "We should check the news," she suggested, exhaustion beginning to set in now that they were temporarily safe. "See if there's anything about the raid." Nico nodded, finding a remote and turning on a small television in the corner. They sat side by side on the sofa, tension returning as they waited for any mention of the Moretti family. They didn't have to wait long. The breaking news banner flashed across the screen, followed by helicopter footage of the Moretti compound swarming with FBI agents and police vehicles. "Major operation against one of New York's most powerful crime families," the reporter was saying. "Sources confirm that Vincent Moretti, alleged head of the organization, has been taken into custody along with his son Dante Moretti and several high-ranking associates." Relief flooded through Mariella. They did it. The raid was real. "What about my mother?" Nico leaned forward, searching the footage for any sign of Sophia. As if in answer to his question, the reporter continued. "In a surprising development, Sophia Moretti, wife of Vincent, is reportedly cooperating with authorities. Sources indicate she may have been instrumental in providing evidence leading to today's arrests." Nico sank back against the sofa, a complex mixture of emotions playing across his features. "She's safe, for now at least." "She made her choice," Mariella reminded him gently. "Just as we've made ours." He nodded, running a hand through his hair in that familiar gesture that still made her heart twist. "We should check the flash drive, see exactly what she gave us." Mariella retrieved her laptop from her backpack, inserting the drive Sophia had provided. What they found exceeded their expectations, not only evidence of Vincent's crimes, but detailed financial records of the Moretti organization's legitimate holdings, separate from the criminal enterprises. "She's given us a roadmap," Mariella realized, scrolling through the files. "A way to salvage the legitimate businesses while distancing ourselves from the criminal operations." "And protection," Nico added, opening a document labeled Insurance. "Look, sworn statements from judges, police captains, even 2 state senators, all admitting to taking bribes from Vincent. If anyone comes after us, this ensures they'll think twice." They spent hours analyzing the contents of the drive, formulating plans, identifying potential allies and obstacles. As the sun reached its zenith, exhaustion finally overcame them both. "We should rest," Mariella suggested, closing the laptop. "We can't make clear decisions when we're this tired." Nico nodded agreement. "There's a bedroom upstairs. You take it. I'll sleep down here." The consideration touched her, another small step in rebuilding what had been broken between them. "Thank you." As she climbed the stairs to the bedroom, Mariella felt a weight lifting. Not completely, but enough to allow her to breathe more freely than she had in months. Vincent was in custody. The truth about her father's murder would come to light, and she and Nico had a chance, however slim, to build something new from the ashes of their past. The bedroom was as simply furnished as the rest of the house, a queen bed with plain white linens, a dresser, a chair by the window overlooking a small garden. Mariella removed her shoes and jacket, too tired to bother with anything else, and sank onto the bed. Sleep claimed her almost instantly, deep and dreamless for the first time since Nico's death. Epilogue. 1 year later, the Mediterranean sparkled beneath a perfect blue sky, waves lapping gently against the hull of the yacht as it cut through the water. Mariella stood at the railing, wind whipping her hair, face tilted toward the sun. Behind her, the coastline of Sicily receded, its ancient buildings and rugged cliffs a reminder of where they had come from and how far they had travelled. Beautiful, isn't it? Nico's voice came from behind her as he joined her at the railing. Grandfather always said there was no place on earth like Sicily. He was right, Mariella agreed, leaning slightly into his warmth as he stood beside her. I can see why he missed it so much. The past year had transformed them both in ways neither could have anticipated. Vincent's trial had dominated headlines for months, his eventual conviction for multiple counts of murder, racketeering and conspiracy, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Dante, facing similar charges, had ultimately accepted a plea deal in exchange for testimony against his father's associates, receiving a reduced sentence of 20 years. Sophia had, indeed, cooperated with authorities, her testimony crucial in dismantling the criminal elements of the Moretti organization. In exchange, she had received immunity and retained control of several legitimate family businesses, which she had promptly signed over to Nico before retiring to a small villa in Tuscany. As for Mariella and Nico, they had used the roadmap Sophia provided to separate themselves from the criminal empire while salvaging the legitimate enterprises, real estate holdings, import-export businesses, restaurants and hotels. The transition hadn't been smooth or simple, but with strategic alliances and careful navigation of legal complexities, they had emerged with a foundation for the future they had once only dreamed about. Mother called this morning, Nico said, his arm slipping around Mariella's waist. She's invited us to visit next month. Says the olive harvest will be spectacular this year. Mariella smiled, covering his hand with hers. I'd like that. It's been too long since we've seen her. Their relationship had healed slowly, deliberately over the past year. Trust rebuilt through consistent honesty, through partnership in business and in life, through the shared work of creating something new from the remnants of their past. The engagement ring Nico had given her before his death remained in a safe deposit box, a relic of a different life, a different future than the one they were now building. What are you thinking about? Nico asked, noting her contemplative expression. The future, she replied honestly. How different it looks from what we once planned. Better or worse? He asked, a hint of vulnerability in the question. Mariella turned to face him, studying the face she had loved, lost and found again. The past year had changed him too, new lines around his eyes, a streak of silver at his temple that hadn't been there before. But his eyes still held the same warmth when he looked at her, the same intelligence and determination that had first drawn her to him. Different, she said finally. More honest, maybe. We're not trying to transform something fundamentally corrupt anymore. We're building something new, something that's ours from the foundation up. Nico nodded, understanding what she meant. Their current enterprises, a boutique hotel chain, an import business specializing in Italian wines and olive oils, a real estate development company focused on revitalizing neglected neighborhoods, were entirely separate from the Moretti legacy. Built with clean money, operated with transparency, staffed by people who knew nothing of their complicated past. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his pocket. Not a ring, he added quickly, seeing her expression. Not yet. That's still your decision, when and if you're ready. He handed her a small box, simple and unadorned. Inside lay a key, old-fashioned heavy brass, clearly not for any modern lock. "What is this?" she asked, turning it over in her palm. "The key to our future," he replied, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Literally. I bought the villa we're heading to now, the one on the point outside Positano that you fell in love with last time we were here." Surprise and pleasure washed over her. "Nico, that's a place that's just ours," he finished for her. "No Moretti history, no DeLuca legacy, just a beautiful house on a beautiful coast where we can build whatever life we choose." The gesture touched her deeply, not just the villa itself, but what it represented. A clean slate, a home that carried no shadows from their past. "Thank you," she said simply, closing her fingers around the key. "It's perfect." They stood together at the railing as the yacht continued its journey along the coast, the future stretching before them like the endless blue of the Mediterranean. Not perfect, not guaranteed, but full of possibilities neither had dared imagine in the dark days after Nico's death and Mariella's grief. "King of Shadows," Mariella murmured, remembering the title Vincent had once bestowed on Nico, half compliment, half warning about his tendency to operate in the grey areas between legitimate and criminal enterprises. "What was that?" Nico asked, not quite catching her words over the sound of the waves. "Nothing," she replied, smiling up at him. "Just thinking that we've both stepped out of the shadows at last." He returned her smile, understanding in his eyes. "Into the light." "Into the light," she agreed, turning her face once more to the sun, the key to their future warm in her palm, the man she had lost and found again solid beside her. The shadows of the past would always be there, a part of who they were and what had shaped them. But they no longer ruled their lives, no longer dictated their choices. That power, the power to determine their own destiny, belonged to them now, and neither intended to relinquish it ever again. The end.